The illusion of dialogue. You've probably been in this situation. Someone disagrees with you, strongly, so you explain. Carefully, you lay out your logic, you make your case. But the more you speak, the more they harden. So you try harder. Maybe if you just show them the contradiction, point out the hypocrisy, expose the flaw in their logic, but it doesn't work. Not only do they not change their mind, they might dig in deeper. So what's happening? Here's the uncomfortable answer. They're not listening, and neither are you. You're not arguing to understand. You're arguing to win. They are too. The moment someone contradicts us, our brain flips a switch. We stop listening. We start searching for flaws, for weak spots, for anything we can use to defend our belief. This process happens in milliseconds, and what makes it worse is it doesn't feel hostile. It feels like thinking. You nod while they speak, but your mind is already preparing your next point. You're not absorbing, you're loading ammo. Psychologists call this the backfire effect. The more clearly you explain your reasoning, the more threatening it becomes to the other person's worldview. So their brain doesn't interpret it as truth, it interprets it as attack. And so does yours. That's the real trap. An argument isn't about truth anymore. It's about identity management. Your sense of self is on the line. Their self is on the line. So no one is actually speaking to the idea. They're just trying not to lose themselves in the process. This is why some arguments can never be won, because they were never really about the argument. Confirmation selective attention. You walk into a room full of strangers. You overhear snippets of conversation, glances, gestures. Somehow, you just know who's on your side, who thinks like you, who doesn't. And you don't think of this as bias. You think of it as intuition, as if you're simply perceiving truth. But you're not. You're filtering reality, and the filter was installed long before you walked in. This is confirmation bias, one of the most well-documented, deeply rooted distortions in human reasoning. It works like this. When we believe something, whether it's political, personal, religious, or even just a hunch, we automatically seek out information that supports it and unconsciously ignore, forget, or discredit anything that challenges it. It doesn't feel like bias. It feels like clarity. In the 1970s, psychologists ran a study on death penalty opinions. They gave participants two carefully balanced reports, one showing capital punishment deters crime, the other showing it doesn't. People read both reports. And guess what? Everyone left the study more certain of their original position. Those in favor said the pro-deterrence study was clearly more scientific. Those opposed said the anti-deterrence study was obviously more valid. Same data, same format. But the conclusions were tailored in the mind, not the evidence. That's how powerful confirmation bias is. You don't just misinterpret new information, you reshape it to fit the belief you already had, and it doesn't stop at studies or headlines. It invades your memory. Studies show that people misremember past experiences to better align with their current worldview. You forget the parts of a story that contradict your image of someone. You distort your past decisions to match your present identity. Over time, you don't just hold a belief, you become it. And that belief starts bending everything you see, even your own memories. The danger isn't just that we cherry-pick facts, it's that we don't realize we're doing it. We think we're seeing the world clearly, when really, we're just reinforcing a version of it we already chose. You don't believe what you see what you believe. From exception to rule, you hear a story, a single case, one vivid example. A man who cured his cancer with celery juice, a child who learned to read before age 2, a billionaire who dropped out of school and made it anyway, and something shifts. The story sticks. It feels significant, more real than statistics, more convincing than probabilities. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to treat the exception as if it disproves the rule. This is one of the most subtle distortions in how the mind handles logic. Because the brain doesn't naturally think in patterns, it thinks in events. It doesn't care if 99.9% of parachutes work. It remembers the one story about the one person whose didn't. It doesn't care that most people don't win the lottery. It remembers the woman who did and bought the ticket on a whim. It doesn't matter that science says correlation isn't causation. It matters that your friend took that supplement and now he sleeps better. This is availability bias, the tendency to mistake vivid, memorable examples as representative of a larger truth. And when emotion is attached to the example, fear, hope, envy, the effect becomes even stronger and the mind begins to bend. Instead of asking, "How often does this happen?" you start asking, "What if this could happen to me?" You start treating rare stories as hidden truths, as if they reveal something that boring statistics have failed to see. This is how conspiracy theories spread, how pseudoscience thrives, how magical thinking survives even in highly educated circles. It's not because people are irrational. It's because their brains are narrative processors, not data processors. A story makes sense. A probability doesn't. That's the deeper issue. The brain doesn't want what's statistically likely. It wants what feels personally relevant, what feels possible, what feels true. So when someone says, "Well, I know a guy who," they're not being illogical, they're being human. The story becomes the lens, and suddenly the exception isn't just real, it's proof. Judgment before justification. You like to think you're fair, that when someone presents a new idea, a new person, a new policy, a new perspective, you evaluate it based on merit. You weigh the evidence, you consider the context, and then you decide. But that's not how your brain works. Not even close. Most of the time, you don't decide what to believe. You feel something instantly, and then go looking for reasons to back it up. This is called the effect heuristic. It means your emotional reaction comes before your reasoning. And then your logic shows up, politely pretending it was in charge the whole time. Let's make this real. In one study, participants were shown a list of policy proposals. Some were liberal, some conservative. But the researchers played a trick. They randomly labeled each policy as coming from the opposite political party. Suddenly, people started supporting things they would normally oppose, simply because they thought it came from their own side. Same words, same idea. Different label, different judgment. They weren't analyzing the policy. They were reacting to the brand. And then, and only then, came the justifications. Well, it makes sense if you think about it. Actually, this aligns with what I already believe. No, it didn't. Not until it felt right first. This isn't just about politics. You do this with people too. You meet someone. They remind you of someone else. Or their voice irritates you, or their smile puts you at ease. You don't notice it, but your emotional system has already filed a report. Trustworthy, dangerous, annoying, charming. And from that moment forward, you'll treat every action they take as evidence of your first impression. If you dislike them, their confidence becomes arrogance. Their jokes become passive aggression. Their silence becomes judgment. If you like them, the same behaviors become confidence, humor, and thoughtfulness. You're not seeing them clearly. You're editing them to fit the verdict you already reached. This is the power of confirmation bias mixed with emotional priming, and it's why first impressions are so hard to undo. Because you're not just making judgments, you're defending them. Think about courtroom trials. We like to imagine a process where each piece of evidence is examined neutrally. But even judges, trained professionals, are influenced by the order in which evidence is presented, by the facial expressions of the defendant, by irrelevant details like the color of their clothing or the pronunciation of their name. Even the font used in written testimony can shift perception. That's how fragile your rationality is. It's not a fortress, it's a stage, built after the play has already been cast. Consistency over accuracy. Let's say you post a bold opinion online. Something like, "Smartphones are ruining human attention." It gets a few likes, maybe a retweet. Maybe someone says, "So true." Now imagine 2 days later, you read a fascinating article that changes your mind. You now think, actually, it's not the phones. It's how we use them. But suddenly, the idea of saying that feels awkward, because now you'd sound inconsistent. This is the invisible pressure we all live under, the pressure to seem unchanging. We admire people who are confident. We praise them for standing their ground. We tell ourselves consistency is a virtue. But here's the trap. When being seen as consistent becomes more important than actually being right, you stop updating your beliefs, even when the evidence is screaming at you. This was studied by psychologist Elliot Aronson, who coined the term self-justification. When our actions or words are public even slightly, we start bending our private reasoning to match our public persona. I can't say I was wrong. People will think I'm flaky. I already made that point. I better defend it now. If I change my mind, I'll look weak. So we double down. We rationalize. We cling. And slowly, we stop learning. Let me tell you a story. In the early 1900s, there was a famous scientist named Lord Kelvin who was convinced the Earth couldn't be more than 100 million years old. He had calculations to back it up. He was confident. He'd made speeches about it. Then newer data from radioactive decay came in. It showed Earth was over 4 billion years old. But Kelvin refused to accept it. Not because the science was weak, but because changing his mind would have meant publicly contradicting himself. It wasn't a science problem. It was a reputation problem. And today, we do the same thing, just smaller, faster, and more often. In arguments, in group chats, at dinner tables. We make one bold statement, and then spend days, even years, defending it. Not because we truly believe it, but because we said it and now feel trapped by it. But here's the irony. Every time you defend something you no longer believe, just to seem consistent, you lose integrity in the name of preserving it. And real wisdom, real growth, it comes from being willing to say, I used to think that, now I don't. That's not weakness, that's evolution. Changing the question to win. It starts with a disagreement. You say something, a belief, a position, maybe just a casual opinion. Someone challenges it. They bring up a counterpoint you didn't expect, a fact you hadn't considered, and for a split second, you hesitate. But instead of rethinking your belief, you pivot, you change the question. You shift the frame, you move the goalpost just far enough that now your argument still works. This is called motivation to protect your belief, but it's often mistaken for open-mindedness. You're not really admitting the flaw, you're dodging it, smoothly, sometimes without even knowing you did it. And the reason it works so well is because it doesn't feel dishonest. It feels adaptable. It feels like you're clarifying your position, but what you're really doing is rescuing it. Let's say someone says, social media is ruining attention spans, and someone else says, but average attention spans haven't decreased in any consistent data. Some people are actually focusing more. Now here's the trap. Instead of reassessing the original claim, the first person might say, well, it's not just attention, it's about mental health overall. Or it's not about the data, it's what I've seen in real life. It feels like the conversation is evolving. But really, the topic has shifted from attention spans to mental health to subjective experience. Each time the pressure builds, the argument shapeshifts. And that shapeshifting isn't random. It's protective. This is what psychologists call the retreat to the unfalsifiable. You start with a bold, testable claim, something that could, in theory, be disproven. But when the evidence gets uncomfortable, you retreat to something more vague, more emotional, or harder to challenge. You start with data. Then you fall back to personal truth, or vague generalizations, or worst-case scenarios. It's not because you're lying. It's because you're trying not to feel wrong. And once you've shifted the question, you usually don't go back to the original one, because now it would feel like losing. So the argument isn't about ideas anymore. It's about not breaking the thread of your own identity. That's the pattern. You move the goalposts not to deceive others, but to protect the version of yourself that needs to be right. And once you see this in others, you'll start seeing it in yourself. Not as weakness, but as the cost of protecting certainty. Certainty from error. There's a strange thing that happens when you remember something. You don't just recall it, you rewrite it. And the more often you recall it, the more it changes, until eventually the memory you're so confident about might be the one that's least accurate. This isn't a glitch. It's how memory works. Most people think of memory like a file cabinet. You store a moment. You open the drawer. You pull it out exactly as you left it. But in reality, memory is more like a Word document that auto-saves every time you open it, including the typos, edits, emotions, and assumptions you accidentally insert. The result: every time you remember something, you're not retrieving a fixed event. You're reconstructing it. And here's the twist. The more confident you are in that memory, the more likely it's been rewritten. Let's take a real-world example. After the explosion of the Challenger shuttle in 1986, psychologists asked college students to write down where they were, who they were with, and how they felt. Then they followed up. 2.5 years later, a third of the students got every detail wrong. Half had major distortions. Some even swore they had watched it live when they hadn't. But what's more fascinating? Many of them argued with the researchers. They insisted their memory was right, even when shown their original writing in their own handwriting. They trusted their current memory more than the written truth. This is called retrieval-induced distortion. Each time you recall something, the brain reinforces the version that feels emotionally satisfying, not necessarily factually accurate. You remember yourself as wiser, kinder, more consistent, or more of a victim, or more justified. Whatever the narrative demands, the memory reshapes itself to serve it. And then it gets filed away again, but slightly different. A little smoother, a little more certain. Not because it's true, but because it fits the story you're telling yourself now. This has enormous implications. You might think you're being logical. I remember exactly what she said. I know how I felt at the time. I've always believed this. But memory isn't evidence. It's a performance, one that rewrites itself based on who you think you are and what version of reality feels safest. So the next time you feel absolutely certain about the past, pause for a moment. Because sometimes the strongest feeling of certainty is just the oldest version of a lie you once told yourself. Thought without control. Let's try something. For the next 10 seconds, don't think of a pink elephant. Did it work? Probably not. In fact, you might be thinking about pink elephants even more now. The shape, the color, the fact that I just mentioned it. That's the trap. You believe your thoughts are yours to command, but they aren't. Not really. Most of your thoughts arrive uninvited. They bubble up from somewhere below consciousness, triggered by memories, smells, random sights, moods, or things you forgot you even noticed. You don't decide to think them. You just become aware of them after they've already started. And then, like a PR manager, you take ownership. Oh, I thought of that because I'm worried about my meeting tomorrow. But often you didn't choose it. You just noticed it, then built a story around it to make it feel like you. Let me tell you a story. A man named Benjamin Libet conducted a famous neuroscience experiment in the 1980s. He asked people to move their fingers while watching a clock. Their brains were being monitored. Here's the strange part. The electrical signal to move the finger appeared before the person reported making the decision. Their brain decided before they did. Their conscious mind caught up after the action had already begun. What does that mean? It suggests that what we call conscious will might be more of a narration than a command. You think you're steering the ship, but you're more like the spokesperson announcing what the ship already decided. This doesn't mean you have zero control, but it does mean you have less than you think. Much of your thinking is reactive, automatic, conditioned by culture, language, trauma, memory, and biology. And the idea that you chose that thought, it's often just an illusion created by the thought itself. So what can you do? Here's the paradox. You don't gain control by forcing your thoughts. You gain clarity by watching them, without judgment. The more you try to dominate your thoughts, the more tangled they become. But if you observe them, let them rise and fall, like clouds, you begin to notice patterns. You see which thoughts are repetitive, which ones come from fear, which are echoes of someone else's voice. And slowly, you build something better than control. Awareness. Because awareness is what lets you respond. Instead of react, it's the space between stimulus and story. And in that space, you're no longer just your thoughts. You're the one noticing them. And that's where real freedom begins. Narrative versus numbers. Imagine someone tells you this. Every year, over 600,000 people die from heart disease in the US alone. You nod. It sounds serious, but it's just a number. Now imagine this instead. A father of 3, healthy, active, never smoked, suddenly collapses one morning while making breakfast. His wife watches, helpless. Their youngest still doesn't understand why dad never came home. Suddenly, it hurts. The number didn't, but the story did. This is called the identifiable victim effect, the phenomenon where a single story moves people far more than any amount of data ever could, even if the data is more important, even if the story is an outlier, even if the logic points the other way. And this isn't a flaw in human thinking. It's how we're wired. For most of human history, your brain wasn't shaped by spreadsheets. It was shaped by campfires. You didn't survive by analyzing statistics. You survived by learning from stories. This person went into the forest and never came back. This person ate the red berries and lived. This person trusted the stranger and vanished. That's how wisdom passed down, in vivid, emotional, personal terms. So today, when someone gives you a chart, your brain listens politely. But when someone gives you a story, especially one that feels real, feels close, your brain feels it. And that feeling often overrides everything else. Marketers know this. Politicians know this. That's why slogans work better than policies. Why testimonials sell better than research. Why one tragic child on the news shifts public opinion more than years of expert consensus. It's not about facts, it's about narrative gravity. But here's the risk. When a story becomes the standard of truth, your logic becomes optional. One dramatic anecdote can make you ignore 1,000 counterexamples. You hear about a plane crash and suddenly fear flying. You hear one bad vaccine reaction and start doubting decades of science. You read one post about someone curing disease with herbs and you question all of medicine, not because it's rational, because it's vivid, and vividness feels like reality. So what do? You don't need to stop listening to stories. You just need to ask, is this story typical or just powerful? Does this represent reality or does it replace it? Because once you realize how easily your mind gets pulled into a narrative, you can begin to feel that tug without letting it drag you away from the truth. The common sense trap. Let's take a look back. For most of history, it was common sense that the sun revolved around the earth. You look up. The sun moves. We don't. Obvious. It was common sense that heavy things fall faster than lighter things. Drop a feather in a stone. See? It was common sense that diseases came from bad smells, not invisible microbes. Smells. Even slavery, segregation, and the idea that women shouldn't vote, these weren't always seen as controversial. They were seen as self-evident, as common sense. So what does that tell us? That common sense isn't actually a form of thinking. It's a shortcut, a label we put on beliefs we've stopped questioning, and that's why it's so dangerous. Because it feels like logic, but resists scrutiny. Psychologists call this the fluency effect. When something feels easy to process, we're more likely to believe it's true. So statements like, you should trust your gut, hard work always pays off, things happen for a reason, slide into the mind with no resistance. They feel right because they're familiar, because they've been repeated. Because they require no thought. And over time, we confuse familiarity with wisdom. Here's a fun experiment. Researchers gave participants trivia questions, but they varied how clearly the questions were printed. Some were in a clear, easy-to-read font. Others were slightly distorted or harder to read. Surprisingly, people gave more accurate answers when the questions were harder to read. Why? Because the difficulty triggered slow thinking. People paused, considered, double-checked. But when the font was easy and familiar, they trusted their gut and made more mistakes. This is how common sense deceives us. Not by being wrong outright, but by turning off our deeper thinking just when we need it most. So next time someone says, "Come on, it's just common sense," that's your signal, not to dismiss them, but to ask, whose sense is it? And is it actually common or just unchallenged? Because truth rarely arrives in cliches, and when it does, it usually isn't trying to prove itself. Loyalty logic. You're in a debate, not a hostile one, just two friends discussing something big, climate change, vaccine policy, or the ethics of AI. You present a well-reasoned argument. Facts, studies, logic, but your friend doesn't budge. They nod and double down on their view. It's frustrating. You feel like logic isn't working. But here's what's really happening. It's not that they can't understand your argument. It's that changing their mind would mean breaking from their tribe. And that feels more dangerous than being wrong. Humans are social creatures first, rational creatures second. Our brains evolved not to seek truth, but to stay inside the group. Thousands of years ago, being exiled from the tribe could mean death. Today, it just means social friction, but your brain still reacts like it's life or death. If I agree with them, I'm not one of us anymore. If I question this idea, they'll think I've changed sides. If I admit they're right, who am I even loyal to? So the brain does something clever and dangerous. It reverse engineers the logic to match the loyalty. Let me give you a vivid example. In 1954, a psychologist infiltrated a doomsday cult. The leader claimed the world would end on December 21st. When it didn't, you'd expect people to leave. But many became more devoted. Why? Because by that point, their identity was fully tied to the group. Leaving meant not just admitting the prophecy was wrong, it meant abandoning their new family, so their logic bent around their loyalty. We were right. Our faith saved the world. The aliens didn't come because we were so spiritually prepared. No matter how absurd it sounds from the outside, inside the tribe, it made perfect sense. And this isn't just cults. It's politics, it's online communities, it's corporate cultures, it's family traditions. If everyone around you believes something, you'll find reasons to believe it too. Not because it's right, but because belonging feels more important than truth. So what's the lesson? Watch yourself. If your reasoning always aligns perfectly with the people you emotionally identify with, pause, ask, did I really reason this out? Or am I protecting my group? Because the scariest thing isn't being wrong. It's being so loyal to a group that you can no longer tell when logic stopped leading and started following. Comfortable objectivity. You probably think of objectivity as a kind of mental superpower, the ability to rise above emotion, to see the facts clearly, to follow the truth wherever it leads. But let's try something. Imagine you're watching a debate between two people. One agrees with you, one doesn't. Same tone, same data, same confidence. Who do you think is more rational? Be honest. You probably sided with the one who made you feel more at ease, who confirmed what you already thought, and you probably told yourself you were being objective. But what if you weren't? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Objectivity doesn't feel like agreement. It feels like betrayal. Real objectivity means entertaining the possibility that you might be wrong. Not temporarily, not hypothetically, but fundamentally, it means looking at something that contradicts your worldview and sitting with it. Not reacting, not rationalizing, just sitting. That doesn't feel calm. It feels destabilizing, and that's exactly why most people avoid it. In 2006, a neuroimaging study at Emory University had participants read statements from political figures, both their own party and the opposing side. When confronted with contradictory information about their candidate, participants didn't activate the reasoning centers of the brain. They activated emotional circuits, the same areas that handle pain, threat, and conflict. But once they reached a conclusion that reaffirmed their original belief, they experienced a dopamine rush, the brain's reward signal. In other words, thinking didn't feel good. Confirming what they already believed did. That's what we call objectivity. But it's not objective. It's just emotional regulation dressed up in logical clothes. Your brain is not built to seek truth. It's built to seek coherence, and coherence feels like clarity, even when it's wrong. This is why smart people often cling hardest to bad ideas, because they've built an elegant internal system that all fits together. And when one piece is threatened, the entire mental scaffolding starts to wobble. So instead of allowing that collapse, the brain digs in. True objectivity requires two things: willingness to be emotionally uncomfortable and the ability to delay feeling right. And those are rare skills. It's easier to confuse objectivity with neutrality, or with politeness, or with standing in the middle of two extremes and calling yourself balanced. But real objectivity isn't about where you stand. It's about how often you're willing to walk away from your own beliefs, even when they once made you feel safe, even when they still do. The balanced bias illusion. You've probably heard someone say, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Both sides have a point. Let's not go to extremes. It sounds reasonable, balanced, mature. And sometimes it is. But other times, it's just laziness pretending to be wisdom. Let's break it down. Say one person claims the earth is flat. Another says the earth is a sphere. A balanced thinker might say, maybe it's somewhere in between. Maybe it's a little curved, but not entirely round. That's nonsense. But because it feels like a compromise, it feels wise. This is called the middle ground fallacy, the assumption that the truth must always be between two opposing views. But that's not how reality works. The truth doesn't sit politely in the center of every argument. Sometimes one side is just wrong. This is where the illusion becomes dangerous. Because being balanced often becomes a way to avoid conflict, to dodge responsibility, to feel intellectually superior without actually investigating anything. It allows you to feel wise without doing the hard work of knowing. You don't have to dig into the evidence. You don't have to take a stand. You just float above the disagreement, nodding at both sides, saying, well, everyone's got a point. It's a safe place to be. But not always an honest one. Here's a real-world example. Climate scientists overwhelmingly agree that human activity is driving global warming. But for decades, public conversation treated it like a debate. Some say it's real, some say it's not. Let's stay neutral. But that neutrality gave false legitimacy to bad arguments. It created the illusion of balance where there was none, and it delayed action for years. Because balance without evidence is just indecision. Of course, not every middle ground is false. Sometimes extreme positions distort both sides. Sometimes compromise is genuinely wise. But the key difference is this. Real balance comes from understanding both positions deeply, not from standing halfway between them to avoid the discomfort of choosing. Because truth isn't always found in the center. Sometimes it's found by leaving the center entirely, by stepping out of neutrality, by being willing to be called biased in order to be correct. So next time you feel the urge to say, well, the truth must be somewhere in the middle, ask yourself, do I actually know what both sides are saying? Or am I just trying to feel reasonable without risking being wrong, because false balance feels safe? But real thinking is riskier and far more honest. Bias blindness. Let's start with a simple question. Who's more biased, you or the people you disagree with? If you're like most people, you'll answer without hesitation. Them, not you. You're the reasonable one, the fair one. You've thought it through. They're the ones being emotional, tribal, irrational. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We all believe we're the exception to bias. This is called the bias blind spot, the tendency to spot flaws in other people's thinking, while remaining blind to those same flaws in ourselves. And it's not just a theory. It's been tested. In one study, participants were shown descriptions of classic cognitive biases, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, the halo effect, and asked to rate how much these affected their thinking compared to others. Consistently, people said they were less biased than the average person, which of course is statistically impossible. Someone has to be average, but no one thinks it's them. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The smarter you are, the more educated, the more confident in your reasoning, the more likely you are to spot bias in others and deny it in yourself. Why? Because intelligence gives you better tools to rationalize your thinking. You can explain your beliefs more clearly. You can defend them more elegantly. You can win arguments. But winning doesn't mean you're right. It just means you're good at arguing. And the better you are at arguing, the harder it becomes to see when you're using those skills to protect, not investigate, your beliefs. Let's put this in a real-world context. Imagine reading two news articles, one that supports your views and one that contradicts them. Which one do you read with suspicion? Which one do you fact-check? Which one do you scroll past faster? Most people believe they're being neutral. But in practice, we're far more skeptical of information that challenges us and far more forgiving of the stuff that fits what we already believe. We don't apply logic equally. We apply scrutiny selectively. And yet, we tell ourselves we're being objective. This is why political polarization feels so intractable. Because both sides are convinced the other is brainwashed. The other side is irrational. The other side is biased. But if everyone believes that, who's actually doing the biased thinking? The answer is everyone. Bias is not a character flaw. It's a feature of how the brain protects identity, coherence, and comfort. The real question isn't whether you're biased. You are. We all are. The question is whether you're aware of it and whether you can catch yourself in those small, silent moments when you're only skeptical of someone because they disagree with you. Smart shortcuts, dumb outcomes. You're scrolling through your feed. A headline jumps out. This one thing is ruining society. It's catchy, clear, satisfying. You nod. It makes sense. You feel like you've understood something big in 5 seconds. That's the power of a mental shortcut. It gives you the feeling of intelligence without the burden of complexity. But here's the catch. What feels like clarity is often just compression. And when you compress too much, you lose the truth. Psychologists call these shortcuts heuristics. They're not bad. They help us make quick decisions in a complex world. You can't stop and analyze every choice. You'd never get through your day. But some heuristics are so comfortable, they become substitutes for actual thinking. Let's take a famous example, the availability heuristic. If something easily comes to mind, we assume it must be important or common or true. So if you've just seen a news story about a plane crash, you'll overestimate the risk of flying, even though statistically it's far safer than driving. Or if you've heard 3 stories in a row about someone quitting their job to become rich on YouTube, you might start thinking, maybe I should quit too. It's not logic. It's mental accessibility. The easier something is to imagine, the more real it feels. Here's another one. The representativeness heuristic. If something seems to fit a pattern, we assume it belongs there, even when it doesn't. Say someone's quiet, detail-oriented, and loves organizing books. Would you guess they're more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? Most people say librarian, but statistically, there are way more farmers. The mind ignores the base rate, the bigger picture, and focuses on the little story it can picture most easily. It feels smart, but it's often wrong. The real problem is that these shortcuts don't feel like shortcuts. They feel like insights, like you've connected the dots, like you've figured it out, and that's what makes them dangerous. Because now you're not just acting on instinct, you're defending it as logic. You've wrapped a gut reaction in a rational costume. This is how simplistic ideas gain traction. Why conspiracy theories spread. Why X is the problem becomes easier to believe than we're dealing with a dozen interlocking systems interacting over decades. That second answer might be true. But it doesn't feel good. It feels slow, unresolved, unclear. The shortcut feels better, cleaner, smarter, until it fails. So next time something feels instantly true, pause. Ask, is this just easy to think, or is it actually accurate? Because some ideas feel smart, not because they're true, but because they fit inside the smallest box your brain can carry. Simplicity over truth. You're trying to understand something, a crisis, a relationship, a political decision, a personal failure. You want to know why it happened. And then someone gives you an answer that clicks. It's all about greed. They were just jealous. It's the government. He was a narcissist. She's just toxic. It's because of that one law, and suddenly you feel a rush of relief. The confusion is gone. The question is closed. You understand now, except you probably don't. This is the illusion of simplicity. The human brain is addicted to clean explanations. We crave stories that fit neatly inside a sentence. But real life rarely does. Take history. Why did World War I happen? In school, you might have learned because Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. It's easy, memorable, but it's also wildly incomplete. That assassination was a spark. The fire came from years of nationalism, secret alliances, economic pressure, imperial ambition, and military buildup. It was a complex web, not a single domino, but we like dominoes better. They feel more satisfying, more logical. Now zoom in. Why did your friend suddenly stop talking to you? Why did that person ghost you? Why did the company reject your job application? You don't know, but your brain doesn't like not knowing. So it picks the simplest emotional answer available. They're selfish. They never liked me. I'm not good enough. These answers hurt, but they give you closure, and closure feels better than uncertainty, even when it's wrong. This is known as the simplicity bias. It's the tendency to favor explanations that are easier to understand, even if they're less accurate. A famous psychology study asked people to explain why a political figure acted a certain way. Participants who were given a simple reason rated the action as more intentional, more moral, and more justified. But when given a complex explanation with multiple factors and uncertainty, they were more likely to call the person dishonest or incompetent. In other words, complexity made people less trustworthy, even if it was more truthful. You see this everywhere. In medicine, it's just gluten. In fitness, it's just carbs. In economics, it's just inflation. In dating, it's just your attachment style. Sometimes those things play a role, but rarely the whole story. And the more emotionally charged the topic, the more tempted we are to compress the truth into something small enough to carry. But here's the cost. Every time we oversimplify, we shrink our understanding. We flatten the people we disagree with. We erase the context. We trade depth for closure, and we mistake that closure for wisdom. The truth is, complexity is not confusion. It's reality. It means there's more than one cause, more than one motive, more than one timeline. It means understanding takes time, and sometimes never fully resolves. But that's okay, because being willing to sit with complexity isn't weakness, it's maturity. It means you don't need a single sentence to make the world make sense. You're okay with stories that don't end cleanly. And that's where real thinking begins. Belief investment trap. You walk into a casino. You've already lost $500. You tell yourself, I'll stop once I win some of it back. You lose again. So you stay longer. You switch machines. You double your bets. You're not gambling anymore. You're defending your past decisions, and the more you lose, the harder it becomes to walk away. Because walking away would mean admitting that you were wrong from the beginning. This is the sunk cost fallacy, and it doesn't just apply to money. It applies to beliefs, to ideologies, to relationships, to identities. The more time, energy, or public commitment you've poured into a belief, the more your brain wants to protect the investment, even if the belief is failing. Let's take an example from history. In the early 1980s, a doomsday cult in Chicago predicted that the world would end on a specific date. When the prophecy failed, outsiders expected the group to disband in shame. Instead, they became more convinced. They doubled down. They said their devotion had saved the world. And they became evangelists, not despite the failed prophecy, but because of it. This sounds absurd, but it's not unique. Anytime you've stood up for something, loudly, publicly, emotionally, you've attached part of your identity to it. And now the belief isn't just an opinion, it's you. So to change your mind, you'd have to unravel your self-image. Admit you were misled, risk being judged, lose status in the eyes of your friends, your group, your followers. Most people will do almost anything to avoid that. This is why conspiracy theories are so sticky. Not because the evidence is strong, but because believers are deeply invested, emotionally, socially, sometimes financially. They've lost friends, burned bridges, staked their identity on knowing the truth, and now, even if the evidence collapses, walking away feels like betrayal. Not just of the belief, but of themselves. But this doesn't only happen at the extremes. Think of a career path you stuck with too long, a book you defended too early, a person you kept trusting, even when they kept hurting you. Why? Because you needed the investment to be worth it. Your brain would rather twist the story than face the possibility that you've wasted your time. That's not weakness. That's how mental accounting works. So the next time you're holding tightly to an idea, ask yourself, do I believe this because it's true or because I've spent too much of myself on it to let go? Because belief doesn't just run on logic, it runs on momentum. And sometimes the hardest thing to admit is that the road you're on was the wrong one from the very first step. Reality bending to avoid error. You tell yourself you value truth, that if the facts change, you'll change your mind, that you'd rather be right than feel right. But here's the contradiction. When faced with evidence that proves you wrong, you don't let go of the belief. You bend the evidence. Not dramatically, not consciously, just slightly, just enough to let the belief survive. Imagine this. You've always believed that you're a good judge of character. Then one day someone you trusted, someone you defended, betrays you. And instead of thinking, maybe I was wrong about them, your brain quietly whispers something else. They must have changed. They're being manipulated. They're not well. The belief that you're a good judge of people stays intact. But the facts around it get rearranged. Not to fit the truth, to fit you. This is called cognitive dissonance, a kind of mental pain that happens when reality and belief collide. And your brain doesn't like that pain. So it fixes the tension, not by changing the belief, but by reshaping reality just enough to make the belief feel safe again. We see this everywhere. People who believe their political leader is honest, even after lies are exposed, don't say, I was wrong. They say, it was taken out of context. Or, all politicians lie. Or, they had no choice. The goal isn't truth. The goal is psychological continuity, to avoid the shame of contradiction. In one famous study, psychologists asked people to rate a job candidate after reading a glowing resume. Everyone rated them highly. Then half the participants were told something unsettling. The resume was fake, made up, intentionally misleading. Now here's the twist. Many people still defended the candidate. They said things like, well, maybe the fake resume still reflects their actual talent. I still got a good feeling about them. They weren't just protecting the resume, they were protecting their own judgment. To admit the resume was fake meant admitting they were fooled, and most people would rather bend reality than face that. This is why real self-awareness feels so rare, because it doesn't look like self-improvement. It looks like collapse. It feels like the ground shifting beneath you, and your mind, well-meaning, efficient, protective, would rather paint the floor a new color than admit you're standing on the wrong one. Let that sit for a moment. When reality and belief are in conflict, most people don't change their minds. They change the shape of the world they see, not because they're dishonest, but because being wrong hurts. The mind change myth. You hear someone say it with pride. I used to believe that, but then I thought about it, and I changed my mind. It sounds wise, grounded, mature, and maybe it is, but most of the time, it's a reconstruction. Because when you look closely at how beliefs actually change, you find something strange. Most of the time, we don't reason our way into a new belief. We feel our way into it, and then we backfill the logic to make it look tidy. Let's tell a story. There's a man named Peter. For years, Peter believed climate change was a hoax. He followed the usual sources. He mocked the scientists. He had the talking points ready. It's natural variation. It's a political tool. Volcanoes release more CO5 anyway. Then one summer, his hometown floods twice. His cousin's house is swept away. He watches the news, but this time, it doesn't feel distant. It feels personal. And something shifts, quietly, privately. He starts reading. He doesn't announce it. He doesn't admit it. But 3 years later, you hear him say, I've thought a lot about this, and the science really convinced me. But that's not the truth. He didn't sit down one day and weigh the evidence like a court case. He felt something change, and only later did the reasoning catch up. This isn't rare. It's how most belief shifts happen. It's why people leave religions, not after debates, but after emotional exhaustion. It's why people abandon political views, not after reading policy papers, but after someone they love is hurt by the system they defended. Emotion opens the door. Logic walks in after and claims it opened it. There's a term in psychology for this, motivated reasoning. It's not just that emotion affects how we think. It's that emotion directs what we think is worth questioning in the first place. Your beliefs aren't a house built on facts. They're a house built on identity, and facts are used to decorate it. But here's what's fascinating. Once we've made the emotional leap, we rewrite the origin story. We say, I looked at the facts. I weighed the pros and cons. I had an honest debate with myself. We remember ourselves as rational, but we're remembering the version of ourselves we want to be, not the one who was actually there. Why do we do this? Because we want to believe our beliefs are earned, that we own them, that they weren't accidents or reactions or emotional escapes. So we clean up the story. We sweep away the parts that felt vulnerable. We edit the process to look like calm, deliberate reasoning. It's not deception. It's narrative hygiene, but the truth. Most of the time, we don't change our beliefs because we thought harder. We change them because something made us feel differently. And only later, sometimes years later, do we build the logic to make it look like a decision. Evidence that backfires. You probably think that when someone sees the facts, clear, undeniable, objective facts, they'll change their mind. You show them the chart, the footage, the peer-reviewed study, and they just dig in deeper. It's frustrating, infuriating, and it feels illogical. But here's the twist. It's perfectly logical, just not in the way you think. There's a psychological effect called the backfire effect. It works like this. When people are shown evidence that contradicts a belief they hold strongly, they don't just ignore it, they treat it as a threat. And the brain doesn't respond to threats with curiosity. It responds with defense, not of the idea, of the identity behind the idea. Because when someone says, you're wrong, Your brain hears, "You're not who you think you are." In 2010, researchers at the University of Michigan ran an experiment. They gave participants fake news stories with incorrect information, like reports that weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. Then they followed up with real corrections, well-sourced, factual rebuttals. You'd expect people to say, "Oh, I didn't know that. I'll update my view." Instead, those who already believed the false claim became more convinced it was true. The correction didn't weaken their belief, it strengthened it. Their brains weren't seeking truth. They were seeking internal stability. And here's what's even more disturbing. Intelligence doesn't protect you from this. In fact, smarter people are often better at it. They're more skilled at cherry-picking data, better at constructing arguments, more confident in their ability to win. So they use logic as armor, not to examine ideas, but to deflect anything that threatens what they already believe. They don't double-check the belief. They double down on it. You've probably done this too. You read an article with a headline that challenges your view. You skim it skeptically. You Google a rebuttal before you've even finished the paragraph. You feel your pulse rise, your shoulders tense, and you tell yourself they're missing the real point. They're biased. They just don't understand. You're not reasoning. You're recovering your sense of self, your group identity, your emotional equilibrium, and new evidence. That's not information. It's an intruder. So what does this mean? That facts don't matter? Not quite. Facts matter, but not first. First, people need to feel safe, emotionally safe, socially safe, psychologically safe. Because if changing your mind means losing your tribe, your status, your certainty, your pride, then you won't change it, no matter how strong the evidence is. So next time someone doubles down in the face of facts, don't assume they're irrational. Assume they're scared, not of you, but of what it would cost to agree with you. Label thought stopper. You hear a word, not an argument. A label. Liberal, conservative, toxic, woke, sheeple, misogynist, snowflake, boomer, narcissist, victim. And in a split second, the person they're talking about, the idea they're describing, shrinks. You stop asking what they mean. You stop wondering what's underneath, because the label already told you what to think. This is the power of categorical thinking. When you assign something a label, you're not just naming it, you're replacing it with a shortcut. And shortcuts feel efficient, but they kill curiosity. You no longer have to ask questions like, what actually happened? What are their motives? What are the exceptions? Could I be missing something? You don't need to ask. Because the label gives you the answer, even if it's wrong. Here's a vivid example. In one famous study, two groups of people were shown the exact same essay. One group was told the writer was a prisoner. The other was told he was a college student. Those who thought he was a prisoner rated the essay as more aggressive, defensive, and self-serving. Those who thought he was a student called it insightful, reflective, and honest. Same words, different label, completely different judgment. Now think about how often this happens in real life. You hear that someone is a Republican, and suddenly you assume 100 things about them. You learn someone supports a protest movement and assume they hate the police. You find out someone believes in astrology and stop taking their opinions seriously. Or they tell you they're a Christian, or a vegan, or a feminist, and you don't ask them what that means to them. You assume what it means to you. The label became the logic. Even worse, we start using labels on ourselves. I'm a free thinker. I'm a critical thinker. I'm not like them. These become armor. You don't have to constantly examine your views because the label already told you you're the rational one, the honest one, the independent one. And that comfort makes you stop growing. There's an old psychological insight. Once you name something, you stop seeing it. Once you label someone as selfish, you stop noticing moments of generosity. Once you label someone as broken, you stop expecting growth. Once you label a belief as stupid, you stop engaging with the reasons someone might hold it. The label becomes a lid, and you close it. So what's the alternative? It's not to ban labels. We need language to make sense of the world. But we have to treat labels like questions, not conclusions, starting points, not endpoints. Because every label conceals a story, a wound, a motive, a contradiction. And the moment you stop being curious about those things, you're not thinking anymore. You're just sorting. And you can't understand what you've already decided to dismiss. Faux open-mindedness. Almost everyone believes they're open-minded. It's a comforting identity. You tell yourself, I'm willing to hear both sides. I'm not attached to my beliefs. I'm always open to changing my mind. But open-mindedness is a bit like humility. The moment you're certain you have it, you've probably already lost it. Here's the real trap. You don't judge your open-mindedness by how you treat unfamiliar ideas. You judge it by how you treat uncomfortable ones, ideas that challenge your values, that threaten your reputation, that make you feel like the villain, not the hero. And those are the ideas your brain defends against first. In one study, researchers asked people to read an essay that contradicted their political beliefs. They were told to analyze it critically, to engage with the argument. Participants claimed to be open-minded, but what did they do? They focused on minor flaws in grammar, dismissed the author's credibility, ignored the main evidence. And afterward they rated themselves as more objective than before. Open-mindedness, to them, didn't mean engaging with the argument. It meant feeling good about having read it. It's performance, not process. And we do this in quieter ways too. You say you're open to feedback, but only if it's polite, only if it doesn't hurt, only if it doesn't come from someone you secretly look down on. You say you're open to new information, but only if it comes from a source you already trust. You say you're open to debate, but only if you're in the mood, only if you know you can win. This isn't open-mindedness. It's curated exposure. Real open-mindedness doesn't feel like browsing new ideas in a bookstore. It feels like being wrong in front of people. It feels like sitting with an idea that rattles you. It feels like not having a comeback and staying quiet long enough to absorb that. It's not about hearing all sides. It's about engaging with the side you'd rather dismiss. So here's a better test. When was the last time you changed your mind? Not because it was popular, not because it was trendy, but because someone showed you something that made you uncomfortable. If you can't remember, you're not as open-minded as you think. And that's okay. But now that you see the illusion, you don't have to keep performing it. You can start practicing it. Cognitive immunity. Your body has an immune system. Its job is simple: protect you from threats. It scans for invaders, detects unfamiliar patterns, and responds often before you're even aware. But here's something most people don't realize. Your mind has one too. And instead of fighting off viruses, it fights off ideas. Think of a belief, any belief, as a living structure in your mind. It's made up of memories, emotions, social connections, personal experiences. It's not just a sentence you agree with. It's part of your internal ecosystem. So when a new idea enters, one that contradicts or threatens that belief, your mental immune system kicks in. It doesn't calmly evaluate. It doesn't say, let's hear this out. It says, defend the host. This is why your first reaction to a challenging opinion isn't curiosity. It's irritation or dismissal, or something you think of as common sense that shuts it down before it even enters. You call the speaker naive or brainwashed or extreme. You question their tone, their intentions, their credibility. You start scanning for flaws, not insight. Not because you're dishonest, but because your mind has labeled the idea as dangerous. And once something is dangerous, rational analysis is no longer the priority. Survival is. There's a term in psychology for this: motivated skepticism. It means you apply higher standards of scrutiny to ideas you don't like and lower standards to ones you do. So if someone says something that supports your worldview, you nod. You accept it at face value. If they say something that challenges it, you demand sources. You question the framing. You dissect every word. It feels like critical thinking, but it's not consistent. It's not a search for truth, it's a selective security system. Here's where it gets really fascinating. Researchers have found that people exposed to contradictory evidence often leave the experience more confident in their original beliefs. Because they didn't just reject the evidence, they practiced rejecting it. They rehearsed their counterarguments. They reinforced their emotional defenses. They rebuilt their belief stronger, like scar tissue after injury. It's called the attitude polarization effect, and it means that the act of defending a belief, even against good evidence, can make that belief more central to your identity. You don't just keep it, you build a fortress around it. Now think about what this means in daily life. If your belief is challenged by a friend, you might argue more forcefully, then go home and feel closer to your position than before. If a teacher or podcast nudges you toward a new perspective, you might nod politely, but inside you're reinforcing the old one even harder. Even when you think you're being open, your immune system might be at work. Not loudly, but quietly, instinctively, underneath. The danger isn't that you defend your beliefs. That's normal. The danger is that you never realize you're doing it. Because your mind doesn't announce, activating defenses now, it just makes the opposing idea feel off, suspicious, wrong in a way that's hard to explain. That's not always logic. Sometimes it's just antibodies. So if you want to grow, really grow, you have to start noticing when you feel that subtle resistance rising in your body, that clenching, that quick dismissal, that "I don't need to read this" reaction. And then, instead of defending the belief, you pause and ask, what am I trying to protect? Because the truth doesn't need armor. Only the ego does. At Hominem Reflex, you're in a disagreement. Someone challenges your belief. Calmly, maybe even politely. At first, you respond with points, logic, reasons. But then something changes. They press too far, say something that hits a nerve. They question not just the idea, but the worldview behind it. And suddenly you're not debating the issue anymore. You're questioning them. You always do this. You don't even care about the truth. You're just trying to win. You're the kind of person who you stopped arguing the point. You started arguing the person. This isn't weakness. It's how the human mind protects itself. Because somewhere inside that disagreement, your belief crossed a line from intellectual to personal. And once a belief becomes personal, any challenge to it feels like an attack on you. Psychologists call this identity protective cognition. It means that when a belief is tied to your identity, your group, your values, your sense of self, your brain stops evaluating information neutrally. Instead, it starts defending the tribe. So when someone disagrees with you, you don't just hear disagreement. You hear betrayal. You hear disrespect. You hear, "You're wrong about who you are." And when that happens, the fastest way to regain control is to shift the spotlight away from the argument onto the other person. It happens all the time. A discussion about policy turns into character judgment. A disagreement about ethics becomes a moral accusation. Even a friendly debate about movies or food spirals into, "You're just being difficult." You always think you're smarter than everyone. We think we're debating ideas, but we're performing identity defense. And in those moments, logic becomes a background prop. The real goal is emotional survival. Let's go even deeper. When you attack someone instead of their argument, you regain a sense of control. You tell yourself, "They're biased. They're brainwashed. They have an agenda." Why? Because that protects you from the harder possibility that they might have a point, and that you, in this moment, might not be right. It's easier to discredit the messenger than to wrestle with the message, and the same thing happens in reverse. When you present a challenging idea and someone ignores your point and attacks your character, they're not just being cruel. They're trying to regulate their own anxiety. because your words destabilize something in them, so they push you away. Not because your argument was bad, but because it was dangerous to their worldview. This doesn't make it okay, but it makes it understandable. We all do it. We all turn people into symbols when the pressure builds. We all turn conversations into defense mechanisms when our identity is at stake. The trick is noticing when it's happening and choosing to step back before the person in front of you disappears behind the role you've cast them in. So next time someone attacks you, pause. They're probably not trying to win. They're trying not to lose themselves. And next time you feel the urge to say, "You're just being emotional. You're just like all the others. You're impossible to talk to," ask yourself, what belief of mine is under threat right now? Because the deeper the attack, the closer you are to something important. And that's where real thinking begins. The middle ground, Mirage. There's a certain kind of person, and maybe you are this person, who says, "I don't take sides. I'm in the middle. Both sides are too extreme." The truth is, somewhere between, it sounds reasonable, thoughtful, above the noise, and in some cases, yes, the middle is where clarity lives, but not always. Sometimes, the middle ground is a mirage, an illusion that makes you feel safe while keeping you from thinking clearly. Let's get real. If one person says the earth is flat and another says it's round, the truth isn't a little curved. If one doctor says vaccines save lives and another internet guru says they're poison, the truth isn't somewhere in between. The truth is testable, trackable, built on decades of research, but splitting the difference makes you feel smart. It allows you to avoid choosing, to avoid risk, to avoid responsibility, because taking a stand, even a thoughtful one, invites judgment. But standing in the middle, that feels neutral. That feels safe. This is called the false compromise fallacy, the assumption that the truth always lies between two extremes. But the real world doesn't work like that. Some ideas are better than others. Some claims are just false. Some arguments deserve to be challenged, not balanced. Let's take a real example. When scientists warned about climate change, many people didn't want to take a side. So the public narrative became, some scientists say it's real, some say it's not, probably it's a bit of both. But 97% of climate scientists agreed. There wasn't a real debate. The middle ground was just a byproduct of media symmetry and social discomfort, and the cost of that false balance. Years of delay, years of rising temperatures, years of pretending maybe was the smart position. Or go more personal. Two friends are in conflict. One betrayed the other. The facts are clear, but a third person says, "I'm not taking sides. You both played a part." Sounds wise, but sometimes it's just emotional cowardice dressed as fairness. Because taking a side when it's right to do so is hard. It costs social capital. It exposes you to attack. It forces you to be specific. Neutrality, on the other hand, costs nothing, and people will praise you for it. But here's the problem. When you always float in the middle, you start believing that certainty is extremism and clarity is arrogance. You confuse intellectual caution with indecision. You avoid thinking deeply by pretending you've thought beyond both sides. Sometimes, yes, the middle is wise, but only if you arrive there through real thought, not fear. Because the middle ground isn't always the moral high ground. Sometimes it's just where people stand when they don't want to be seen. Harmful but right. Imagine you're in a debate. Someone tells you that your belief, something you've defended for years, isn't just incorrect, but harmful. Maybe it promotes inequality, or spreads misinformation, or dismisses someone's lived experience, or hurts people you've never met. And in that moment, you feel it, not guilt, not curiosity, but defensiveness. Because before you can think about who it might hurt, your mind goes somewhere else. Are they calling me a bad person? Do they think I meant to cause harm? They're overreacting. They're twisting my words. Suddenly, it's not about the people affected. It's about you. This is one of the brain's most stubborn instincts, protecting your self-image at the expense of others. And most of the time, it's invisible. You don't wake up and think, "Today I will ignore the harm my beliefs are doing." You just think, "I'm not the kind of person who believes harmful things." And when someone suggests otherwise, your brain doesn't process it as feedback. It processes it as threat. Let's take an example from education. For years, teachers in the US used a method called zero-tolerance discipline. It was based on a belief: strict punishment equals safer schools. It made sense. It felt fair. But over time, research showed the policy didn't work. It disproportionately harmed Black students. It increased dropouts. It made schools more hostile, not safer. Still, many educators defended it. Not because they wanted to hurt students, but because admitting harm would mean admitting they had supported it, implemented it, maybe even believed in it proudly. And that hurt more than the data, because the harm was abstract, but being wrong, that was personal. This happens everywhere. A parent defends harsh discipline, even after learning it caused lasting anxiety in their kids. A public figure refuses to apologize, not because they still believe what they said, but because apologizing would mean they've been wrong in public, maybe for years. A scientist resists new evidence because it would discredit a theory they built their reputation on. It's not always cruelty. It's ego pain, disguised as principle. And here's the cruel irony. When being wrong becomes unbearable, you start bending your beliefs not to match the truth, but to protect the version of yourself you want to believe in. You keep holding on, not because your belief helps people, but because letting go would hurt you. So how do you escape that trap? You start by asking a new question. Not, "Am I a bad person?" but "Is this idea doing harm, even if I didn't mean it to?" Not, "Is this belief defensible?" but "Is it useful, kind, or fair?" Because being wrong is survivable. But ignoring harm just to preserve your pride is how good people slowly become the thing they swore they weren't. Certainty kills understanding. There's a strange thing your brain does. When you finally feel like you get it, a topic, a belief, a problem, you stop learning. Not because the subject is finished, but because your need for understanding has been replaced by the feeling of certainty. Understanding is messy. It's open-ended. It requires effort, humility, and time. Certainty? That's clean. It's fast. It feels like closure. And the moment you feel it, your mind rewards you. Neuroscientists have found that when people experience certainty, they show increased activity in the reward system of the brain, the same system activated by pleasure, food, status, even drugs. In other words, certainty feels good, which means your brain starts chasing it. Not knowledge, not accuracy, not complexity, just that satisfying mental click of, "Ah, I know what this is." And once you have it, you stop looking deeper. Let's make this real. You hear someone talk about inflation. You catch the phrase "government printing money," and it clicks. You tell yourself, "That's what causes it." Got it. But you haven't studied monetary policy. You don't know about supply chains, wage spirals, interest rates, or global commodity shocks. Still, it doesn't matter, because the feeling of understanding has landed, and that feeling blocks further learning. Not because you're closed-minded, but because your brain thinks the case is closed. This happens in classrooms, in friendships, in political arguments, and in the quiet conversations we have with ourselves. We hear a simple explanation, a story that fits, a cause that makes sense. And instead of asking, "What am I missing?" we say, "Finally, I understand." Except we don't. We've just confused knowing a story with knowing the system. This is called cognitive closure, the mental tendency to resolve uncertainty as quickly as possible so you can move on. But closure isn't always earned. And when we substitute clarity for depth, we end up with strong opinions based on shallow comprehension. We end up defending conclusions we didn't even explore properly. Here's a subtle example. Someone says, capitalism is broken, and you nod, it feels true. Or someone else says, socialism always fails. And again, it feels true. But what do those words really mean? What systems are being described? What trade-offs are being measured? What specific examples are being referenced? Usually, we don't know, we just feel like we do. Because certainty replaces the need to find out. So the real danger isn't ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. Because when you don't know something, you're still curious, still teachable, but when you're certain, you've built a wall. And from behind it, you can't see what's missing because you've already told yourself, I understand this, when really you only understand enough to stop asking questions. The cost of not knowing. Try saying it out loud. I don't know. Sounds simple, but watch what happens inside your body when you say it, even just to yourself. Tension, vulnerability, a little bit of fear, maybe even shame. Why? Because not knowing feels like weakness. In a world where confidence is currency, saying, I don't know feels like dropping your weapon, and the brain hates it. Here's what's fascinating. People often pretend to know things they don't, not to deceive others, but to protect themselves from embarrassment, from judgment, from the uncomfortable reality that maybe they're not as informed as they want to be. You see it in meetings, in interviews, in classrooms, even at dinner tables. Someone brings up a topic, AI, climate policy, quantum physics, the stock market, and instead of admitting uncertainty, we nod, we say something vague. We pivot, we bluff. Why? Because I don't know feels like falling in social status. It signals uncertainty, and uncertainty feels like inferiority. Here's a fun example. In one study, participants were asked a series of trivia questions, but some of the topics didn't actually exist. Like, what year did the fictional city of Wakanda join the United Nations? And guess what? Many participants gave answers, dates, details, explanations, all completely made up. They weren't lying to be malicious. They were trying to avoid the awkwardness of admitting ignorance, because saying, I don't know, made them feel exposed. And yet, I don't know is one of the most powerful phrases in human learning. Every real discovery, scientific, personal, philosophical, starts there. It's the moment your brain opens, the doorway to curiosity, the signal that something new can enter. But if you've been rewarded your whole life for being smart, for having the answer, for being quick, for always knowing, then I don't know doesn't feel like a beginning. It feels like failure. And this fear shows up everywhere. People argue instead of asking. They double down on guesses instead of seeking help. They dismiss questions as stupid just to avoid having to admit they're confused too. In politics, leaders dodge. In debates, bluffing wins. In social groups, confidence gets retweets. But curiosity gets silence. We've built a culture that punishes not knowing. And then we wonder why no one seems to be thinking critically anymore. But here's the truth. Not knowing is only a weakness if you're pretending that you do. Because the moment you admit it, to yourself, to others, you create a space for real intelligence. Not the performance kind, the growing kind. The kind that starts with, I don't know, but I'd like to. That's not the end of thinking. That's where it actually begins. The feeling of truth. You've probably experienced this. You hear a statement, maybe a quote, a headline, a theory, and something inside you goes, yeah, that's true. You don't stop to fact check. You just feel it. That's the moment to be careful. Because truth has a feeling, but the feeling doesn't always come from truth. Let's break it down. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. It means that the more often you hear something, the more likely you are to believe it, regardless of whether it's true. This was first discovered in the 1970s. Researchers gave participants a list of statements, some true, some false, and asked them to rate how accurate they were. Then, weeks later, they brought the same people back. They mixed the same statements with new ones, and guess what? Even participants who knew a statement was false were more likely to rate it as true if they'd heard it before. Just repetition. That's all it took. Not logic, not memory, just familiarity. Now think about what this means in your life. If a claim is easy to understand, you're more likely to believe it. If it's phrased simply, it feels smarter. If it rhymes, it feels more true. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. If it's delivered with confidence, your brain interprets that as evidence. The mind doesn't just check facts. It checks feelings, fluency, comfort, certainty, and then quietly assumes they point to reality. They don't. Want an example? You hear, humans only use 10% of their brains. You swallow 8 spiders a year in your sleep. Sugar causes hyperactivity in children. All of those are false. But if you've heard them before, even casually, your brain gives them a familiarity boost. And that boost feels like truth. Not because you investigated, but because it slid in smoothly. And here's the disturbing part. Even after being corrected, many people continue to believe the false version because the correction feels more complicated, slower, heavier. And the brain doesn't just want truth, it wants mental ease. This is why misinformation spreads so well. Not because it's persuasive, but because it's fluent. It hits your nervous system the right way, smoothly, emotionally, memorably, and gets mistaken for clarity. So how do you protect yourself? You start by asking, do I believe this because I remember learning it, or because I've heard it enough times that it feels real? You ask, does this feel true because it's simple, emotional, and confident, or is it actually backed by something I can trace? Because feeling right and being right are not the same thing. And when your brain forgets that, you don't just fall for lies, you defend them with the same confidence you use to defend the truth. Confidence as evidence. Imagine 2 people walk into a room and say the exact same sentence. One says it with hesitation, the other with conviction. Which one do you believe? You already know the answer. Confidence feels like truth, even when it's not. This is one of the strangest illusions of the mind. We often don't evaluate claims based on content. We evaluate them based on delivery, a confident voice, a firm posture, unwavering eye contact, the absence of doubt. These cues are easy to mistake for evidence, not because they are proof, but because, evolutionarily, they've worked like proof. Go back to our early ancestors. In a tribal group, certainty could mean survival. If 2 people argue over which direction to run from a predator, who gets followed? The one who sounds sure, not the one who says, well, maybe. Fast forward to today. We still follow confidence in business meetings, politics, media, even personal relationships. It doesn't matter if the confident person is wrong. What matters is how their certainty triggers your trust. This is called the confidence heuristic, a mental shortcut where we use confidence as a substitute for credibility, and it's incredibly dangerous. Here's the twist. The effect works on yourself too. The more confidently you say something, the more your brain starts to believe it. Even if it's false, even if you were unsure just moments ago, confidence becomes a kind of internal social proof. You hear your own voice sounding certain, and you take that as validation. So you double down, speak louder, hesitate less, and now to everyone around you, including yourself, you appear right, even if you're miles from the truth. You see this in misinformation all the time. The people spreading conspiracy theories often sound more certain than the cautious scientists who say, we're still researching. You see it in bad leaders, in online influencers, in charismatic frauds. But you also see it in good people who are just afraid to seem unsure. So they hide their questions, suppress their doubt, and say things they're only half sure of with full force. Why? Because the world rewards confidence, even if it's empty. So how do you fix it? Not by distrusting every confident voice, but by asking, do they sound sure or do they show their sources? And with yourself, am I confident because I'm informed? Or am I confident because I've said this so many times, I forgot to check if it's true? Real wisdom isn't loud. It pauses. It questions. It stays open. Confidence should come after clarity, not in place of it. Intelligence justifies. There's a strange assumption people make about intelligence, that smarter people are better thinkers, that they're more rational, more self-aware, less biased. But that's not what the data shows. In many cases, the smarter you are, the more elaborate your self-deception becomes. Not because you're dishonest, but because you're equipped. You don't eliminate bias. You weaponize intellect to defend it. Let's break it down. Imagine two people confronted with evidence that challenges a belief. One says, "That's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way." The other, more intelligent, more articulate, says, "Well, actually, if you look at it from this angle, and if you question the source and take into account these exceptions, then the belief still stands." Who sounds more thoughtful? The second one. But who's actually thinking? That's not so clear, because in many cases what looks like reasoning is actually rationalizing. It's not a search for truth. It's a performance of coherence. This has been tested. In 2012, researchers at Yale found that people with higher analytical intelligence were more likely to interpret data in biased ways when the data threatened their political identity. In other words, smarter people weren't better at finding the truth. They were better at finding ways to explain it away. They didn't think more clearly, they thought more defensively. They had the mental tools to surgically defend what they already believed. This is what intelligence often becomes, not a light, but a shield. It gives you vocabulary, logic, references, statistics, frameworks, and you use all of it, not to test your beliefs, but to protect them from inspection. You think you're being precise, but you're just being efficient at not changing. Here's the trap. The more intelligent you are, the more internally consistent your worldview becomes. Everything connects. Everything fits. Every challenge has a workaround, and so you start mistaking coherence for correctness. But a system can be beautifully constructed and still built on a false foundation. Think of conspiracy theorists, the really intelligent ones. They don't sound foolish. They sound convincing. They've got graphs, timelines, citations. They'll debate anyone. They've built a mental fortress, and they're so good at defending the belief that they never stop to question why it needs defending in the first place. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Being smart doesn't protect you from bad thinking. It just gives you more convincing reasons to keep doing it. And unless you actively challenge your own justifications, not once, not for show, but habitually, you might become the most eloquent prisoner of your own illusions, not because you lacked intelligence, but because you had just enough to get away with it. Logic as weapon. Logic is supposed to be neutral, a method, a lens, a way to get from question to clarity. But give logic to someone with something to protect, and it stops being a tool. It becomes a weapon, not to discover truth, but to win. Picture a courtroom. Two lawyers, same set of facts, two completely opposite stories. Each side uses logic, cherry-picked, reframed, reconstructed, to build a narrative that defends their client. And that's the key. Logic is not immune to motive. It's a tool, and tools can be aimed. Now take this out of the courtroom. Put it in a Reddit thread, a boardroom, a relationship, a classroom. Watch how quickly logic shifts from inquiry to combat. You present a thought, not even an opinion, just a musing, and someone jumps in with surgical counterpoints. You weren't trying to argue, but now you're defending, and they're winning. They're not listening, they're scoring. Because for them, logic isn't about understanding, it's about dominance. This is more common than we like to admit. Highly articulate people, especially online, will demolish an idea not because it's wrong, but because they can. They twist definitions, change premises, focus on obscure edge cases, demand flawless precision from everyone but themselves. They weaponize whataboutism, demand impossible nuance, or accuse others of fallacies they commit 5 seconds later. And they'll tell you they're just being rational. But they're not solving. They're defending territory. Here's a term you might not know: mate and Bailey. It's a debate trick. The mate is a defensible, watered-down version of a belief. The Bailey is the real, bold belief someone wants to hold. When challenged on the Bailey, they retreat to the mote. You misunderstood me. I was just saying something obvious. But later, they return to the Bailey, pretending they already proved it. It's not thinking. It's tactical maneuvering. Logic in this case isn't used to clarify. It's used to escape. And that's the danger. Logic, used honestly, is one of humanity's greatest tools. But logic, used strategically, can fortify delusion. It gives you armor. It gives you weapons. It lets you win every argument, but sometimes at the cost of truth. Because real understanding often requires vulnerability, admission, doubt. And there's no room for that when you're too busy loading the next syllogism to ask yourself, what am I really trying to prove here, and why do I need to win so badly? Blind to the obvious. Smart people love complexity. They crave it. They trust it. Because complexity feels earned, like depth, like wisdom. But sometimes, the truth is simple, and that's a problem, because intelligence doesn't like simple. Let me give you a real story. A group of top-tier engineers once spent weeks trying to diagnose a critical system failure. They wrote custom monitoring tools, simulated traffic, built elaborate models, and still, the bug persisted. Then a junior technician walked in, looked at the log files and said, "You're out of disk space." That was it. A simple problem, a simple fix. But the experts couldn't see it because they were looking for brilliance, not truth. This happens more often than you think. The smarter you are, the more you want problems to be worthy of your intellect. So when something seems too obvious, you dismiss it. When someone gives a plain answer, you scoff at it. And when the truth shows up wearing overalls instead of robes, you walk right past it, searching for something more elegant. This isn't just about computers or code. It shows up in psychology. Therapists see it all the time: high-functioning, analytical clients who can quote research, explain attachment theory, map their trauma, recite the difference between ego and superego, but still can't say, "I'm lonely. I feel unwanted. I don't know what to do." They've built a cathedral of understanding and hidden themselves in the walls. Because raw truth isn't clever, it's vulnerable. And intelligence often works to avoid that. There's a deeper problem here. When you believe that all good answers must be complex, you create a bias. You start rejecting simple truths on principle. You overlook common sense. You resist emotional insight. You talk yourself out of clarity. You begin to assume that anything easy must be wrong, and that leads you to overcomplicate your life. You don't fix the relationship. You dissect it. You don't rest. You research optimal recovery protocols. You don't say how you feel. You journal about communication theory. It feels intelligent. But it's just avoidance with better vocabulary, and it gets worse. Because once you develop this pattern, you begin to think only other smart people can understand you. You start building a reality where truth is something only you can see, where everyone else is too simplistic, too naive, too emotional. But often, they're just being human, and you're being clever to your own detriment. Let's be clear, intelligence is not the enemy, but it comes with a cost. And one of the most common costs is missing what's obvious because you're too busy trying to be exceptional. Sometimes the most powerful realization you can have is that something isn't complicated. You don't need a theory. You don't need a framework. You just need to admit, this hurts. I'm afraid. I know what I need to do. I've just been talking myself out of it. That's not simple thinking. That's clear thinking. And for the overcomplicated mind, it might be the hardest truth of all. Strategy over solution. Here's a hard truth. Most of the time, you're not thinking to solve a problem. You're thinking to position yourself. to come out looking good, to feel in control, to prove a point, to protect your sense of identity. You think you're reasoning, but you're strategizing. Let's try a thought experiment. Imagine someone you don't like says something vaguely controversial, something that under other circumstances you might agree with. Do you pause and consider it? Probably not. You start scanning, not for insight, but for weakness. What's wrong with this claim? Where's the hypocrisy? What can I say to dismantle it? Now imagine someone you do like says something sketchy. Instead of questioning it, you start justifying, reframing, assuming good intent. Same logic, different strategy. We don't like to admit this. We want to believe we're thinking with clarity and objectivity. But in practice, the brain acts more like a PR firm than a scientist. It doesn't test hypotheses, it protects narratives, especially the ones that involve you. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning. It's what happens when you unconsciously direct your mental energy toward a preferred conclusion. It feels like logic. It even uses logic, but it's not a path to truth. It's a performance of reason designed to serve a goal. You start with what you want to believe. Then you reverse engineer the argument. This isn't just about politics or online debates. It happens in relationships. Ever find yourself in an argument where you suddenly remember a dozen tiny incidents that support your case, but completely forget the ones that weaken it? That's strategy. Or maybe you're trying to make a decision, a job, a relationship, a move, and you tell yourself you're weighing the pros and cons. But if someone listens closely, they'll notice that your pros are beautifully detailed and your cons are vague and forgettable. Strategy again. We are strategic thinkers by default. Because at the deepest level, the brain's job isn't to be accurate, it's to be safe, accepted, respected, in control. So when something threatens your worldview, your self-concept, your social standing, or your group membership, your mind doesn't go silent, it goes to work, not to figure it out, but to figure out how to not have to figure it out. This doesn't mean you're dishonest. It means you're human. But here's the danger. The more intelligent you are, the more subtle and convincing your strategies become. You're not just playing defense. You're building an entire chessboard where every move looks rational, but every outcome is rigged. And unless you stop and ask yourself, wait, what am I actually trying to do right now? You might end up solving a game instead of solving a problem. Wisdom or rationalization. There's a certain kind of voice you trust. Measured, calm, articulate. It sounds like someone who's thought things through, who's careful, smart, balanced. But sometimes that voice, the one that feels like wisdom, is actually just rationalization in disguise. Let's say something painful happens. You get rejected. You fail. You make a terrible decision, and it haunts you. You could sit with the discomfort, explore it, learn from it. But often, you don't. Instead, you explain. It was a blessing in disguise. That wasn't really what I wanted anyway. I had to go through that to become who I am. Now that might be true, but you're not saying it because it's true. You're saying it because it feels better than saying, I made a mistake and I hate how it feels. Rationalization is emotional anesthesia, and it's dangerously effective. Here's the tricky part. Rationalization doesn't sound defensive. It doesn't sound angry or desperate. It sounds profound. It uses metaphors, stories, sophisticated logic, sometimes even spiritual language. It feels like insight, but what it really does is close the loop too early. It gives you an answer so you don't have to ask a deeper question. You see this in relationships all the time. Someone stays in a situation that's clearly unhealthy. You ask them why. And they give you a soft, reasoned, almost philosophical reply. Love is complicated. No one's perfect. There's history you wouldn't understand. They're not wrong, but they're not being honest either. They're making the discomfort sound wise so they can stay in it without guilt. That's not logic. That's survival. In therapy, there's a phrase, intellectualization is the last line of defense. It means that once all the emotional defenses have been stripped away, blame, denial, avoidance, the mind builds a castle of ideas. It frames the hurt, justifies it, puts it in a theory, and suddenly, you've got a tidy narrative where nothing really has to change. It's healing without transformation. It's wisdom without growth. So how do you tell the difference? How do you know when you're being wise versus when you're just rationalizing? Ask yourself this. Does this explanation help me act differently or just feel better about not acting at all? If it moves you forward, it might be wisdom. If it keeps you still, no matter how beautifully it's worded, it's probably just rationalization. The rationality myth. Somewhere along the way, we invented a hero, the rational, intellectual, cool-headed, unbiased, detached, a mind so pure that it runs like a machine, spitting out truth, unclouded by feeling. We've seen him in films, read him in books, met people who tried to become him. But here's the truth. He's a myth. Real humans don't think like computers, even the smartest ones. In fact, the more intellectually gifted someone is, the better they are at hiding how emotional their thinking really is. They don't eliminate bias, they refine it, dress it up in logic, build entire cathedrals of argument to protect beliefs they don't even realize are emotional. And then they stand in the pulpit and preach objectivity. This isn't to insult intelligent people, it's to reveal a hidden trap. When you believe in the rational intellectual, as an ideal, as a goal, you start aiming for something that doesn't exist. You start cutting yourself off from the messy parts of thinking, emotion, intuition, uncertainty, contradiction. You begin to equate feeling with failure, and that's dangerous, because feelings aren't distractions. They're data. They tell you what matters, what's at stake, what's driving your urgency, your values, your focus. Without emotion, logic has no aim. Let's use an example. Say someone tells you they made a difficult decision. Logically, they chose job A over job B because it paid more, had better hours, and a clearer path to promotion. Sounds rational, but why did those factors matter more? Why not pick the job that felt more inspiring? Even if it was riskier, why define success that way? Because somewhere underneath, they felt that security mattered more than freedom, or prestige more than creativity, or predictability more than growth. The values were emotional. Logic just filled in the blueprint. Even in science, the temple of rationality, emotion creeps in. Einstein's intuition led him before his math did. Feynman famously warned against self-deception, that smart people are the easiest to fool because they're the best at reasoning their way into whatever they want to believe. And if that's true of physics, what does that say about your Twitter arguments? There's one more cost to idolizing the rational intellectual. It distances you from others. You start seeing emotional people as inferior. You roll your eyes at passion. You dismiss concern, doubt, urgency, as if they're noise in an otherwise perfect machine. But thinking that way turns you into something worse than irrational. It turns you into someone who's smart but disconnected, detached from others. Detached from yourself, trapped in a tower of reason, with no windows facing in. So what's the alternative? It's not to throw away logic. It's to stop pretending logic is separate from feeling. To recognize that intelligence doesn't mean being cold, it means knowing why you believe what you do and acknowledging that some of those reasons live in the body, not just the brain. Wisdom isn't the absence of emotion. It's the ability to see where emotion ends and reasoning begins, and to know when they're talking over each other. That's not a myth. That's maturity. Arrogant skepticism. Let's start with a scene. You're in a discussion. Maybe in person, maybe in a comments section. And someone says, with folded arms and a raised eyebrow, I'm just being skeptical. But what they mean is, I already know you're wrong. That's not skepticism. That's arrogance wearing a lab coat. Skepticism, real skepticism, is a process. It's the ability to pause your beliefs, to ask, What would change my mind? What am I missing? Where could I be wrong? But that's not how most people use it. Instead, they use skepticism as a rhetorical weapon. It becomes a default position of superiority, a way to invalidate without thinking, to avoid engagement while appearing smart. It doesn't question to understand, it questions to dismiss. And ironically, it stops being skeptical the moment it assumes it already sees through everything. Take this example. You say something sincere, maybe personal, maybe hopeful. And someone replies, sounds like pseudoscience. I'm skeptical of that. Where's your data? Reasonable questions, but delivered with the confidence of someone who isn't actually interested in the answer. It's a performance. And here's the kicker. That performance feels good because it puts you in control. You're not vulnerable. You're not curious. You're above it all. But the higher you float in that mindset, the less you actually learn. Let's look at this from history. The greatest scientific breakthroughs didn't come from people who dismissed ideas. They came from people who doubted their own. Richard Feynman, Nobel-winning physicist, once said, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." That's real skepticism. It's not about proving others wrong. It's about constantly testing your own understanding. It's about intellectual humility, not intellectual posture. The danger is this. When arrogance dresses as skepticism, it kills conversation. It creates a false sense of mastery. You stop listening. You stop wondering. You become someone who critiques everything but understands nothing. You learn to identify flaws in arguments, but not in yourself. And eventually, you become emotionally numb to any idea that can't be explained in a neat diagram or double-blind study. You become unteachable. So, how do you tell the difference? It's subtle. Ask yourself, am I skeptical because I want to learn more? Or am I skeptical because I want to feel smarter? The first makes you open. The second makes you smug. And if you find yourself reaching for the second, don't worry. We all do it. The trick is not to pretend skepticism makes you better. The trick is to realize that the moment you're sure you're the smartest person in the room, you've already stopped being one. Self-echo thinking. We often think echo chambers are something external. You know, social media feeds, curated friend groups, ideological bubbles. But there's a quieter one, and it lives much closer. It's the one inside your skull. You can be alone. In your room, no internet, no news, no one around, and still, you'll hear only the thoughts you've already approved. Here's how it works. Your brain is a master of pattern. Once it forms a belief about the world, about yourself, about people, it starts favoring thoughts that match that belief. It's not malicious, it's efficient. New ideas get compared to old ones. Conflicting data gets filtered. Contradictory feelings get silenced. Before long, you're not thinking, you're rehearsing. Rehearsing the same stories, the same assumptions, the same internal voices, and each time you do, they feel more true, not because they are, but because they're familiar. Let me give you a simple personal example. Say you believe deep down that you're not good enough. Even if life is going well, your brain will find ways to make the narrative fit. A compliment? They're just being polite. A success? Must have been luck. A mistake? See? Told you. That's the echo chamber. Your own thoughts reinforcing your own worst beliefs and filtering everything through that lens. It's self-gaslighting. And it works because it feels rational. You might think, but I question myself all the time. Isn't that the opposite of an echo chamber? Not quite. Doubt can also echo. It can become its own bias. You can doubt everything except the doubt itself, which means you trust your skepticism more than any possible answer, and round it goes. So how do you break out? Not by thinking harder. You're already doing that. If you could outthink the echo chamber, you would have by now. The real answer is discomfort, because the thoughts that disrupt your inner echo usually don't feel logical at first. They feel intrusive, off-brand, emotionally threatening. Maybe it's a compliment you don't believe. Maybe it's a question you're afraid to ask. Maybe it's a perspective you've dismissed for years. But if it rattles you, it might be worth listening to. There's a reason therapy works. It's not because the therapist is smarter than you. It's because they say things your internal narrator won't. They disrupt the loop, sometimes gently, sometimes not. And in that disruption, you start to hear something you haven't heard in a long time, a new thought. The echo chamber of your own mind doesn't need walls, just repetition, just belief, just a story you never challenge because it's yours. But here's the truth. The most dangerous echo chamber is the one that feels like clarity. And the only way out is to let in something that doesn't sound like you, not to obey it, but to consider it, even if just for a moment. Winning, but missing the point. There's a strange kind of person you've probably met. They don't shout. They don't insult. They speak with calm precision, cut through others' points like a surgeon, and they always win. In debates, in discussions, even in casual disagreements, they're the ones who have a comeback, a counterexample, a clever twist. You walk away from the conversation thinking, well, I guess they're right. But something doesn't sit right. Not because they were aggressive, but because they were so good at winning. You never had time to ask, was that even the point? Winning an argument is not the same as discovering the truth. But if you're articulate, persuasive, quick-witted, it's easy to confuse the two. You say something sharp, someone stumbles, you feel the high of dominance. And in that moment, your brain rewards you. I was right. But what really happened was that you got better at defending yourself and worse at listening. This is especially dangerous in close relationships. Imagine your partner says, "You don't really listen to me." You could instantly reply, "That's not true. I just spent 20 minutes on the phone with you last night. I asked how your day was, didn't I?" You never say anything until you're upset. All technically valid, all neatly reasoned. But you've just won a battle by proving you're not emotionally available. Congratulations. You were right, but now they feel alone. And you won't feel that until much later, when the conversation's gone quiet, and so has the relationship. This happens at work too. The smartest person in the meeting shoots down every suggestion with a well-reasoned critique. They don't say that's stupid. They say that introduces edge cases. That violates scalability. That's inconsistent with our roadmap. They're not wrong. But over time, nobody brings them ideas. Not because they're hostile, but because they've made it clear being right is more important than being open. And so, their team stops innovating. They've won the argument and lost the trust. The truth is, you can win every argument and still be completely devastatingly wrong, because being right isn't just about logic, it's about context, emotion, humility, curiosity. It's about knowing when to stop talking and start listening, especially when your instincts scream to speak. Here's a harder truth. Sometimes the desire to win is just the fear of feeling wrong. So instead of learning, you defend. Instead of exploring, you retreat into certainty. Instead of connection, you get applause from yourself. And the longer this goes on, the more it hollows out your life. Because one day you'll realize you've spent years sharpening your sword in a world that just wanted you to put it down and hear them. So here's the challenge. Next time you're in a disagreement, don't ask, "Am I right?" Ask, "Am I making space for the truth to even show up? Am I protecting my pride or pursuing understanding? If I stop defending myself, what might I finally learn?" Because you don't grow by winning. You grow by letting go. Agreement. Illusion. You walk into a room full of people who already agree with each other. The conversation is flowing. Heads are nodding. Laughter. Approval. Alignment. Someone says something that sounds a little off to you, but not outrageous. Just off. You pause. Do you raise your hand? Ask a question? Say, "Wait, that doesn't really make sense to me." Probably not. Instead, you tell yourself, if no one else sees a problem, Maybe I'm the one who doesn't get it. And you nod. Welcome to the most invisible force in human thought. Agreement feels like truth. Let me tell you a strange story. In the 1950s, a psychologist named Solomon Asch ran a simple experiment. 8 people sat around a table. They were shown 3 lines on a card, A, B, and C, and asked which one matched the line on a second card. The answer was obvious. Anyone could see it. But here's the trick. 7 of those 8 people were actors. And when the first person said the wrong answer, everyone else followed. The real participant sitting near the end would start sweating, looking around, confused. But then often, they'd say the same wrong answer too. They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to stand out. They didn't want to be the one who saw what no one else seemed to see. And here's the terrifying part. When researchers asked the participants afterward, some of them genuinely believed the wrong answer was right. Their perception had shifted just to stay in the group. Agreement changed their reality. This doesn't just happen in psychology labs. It happens every day. You laugh at jokes you don't actually think are funny. You repost opinions you're not totally sure about. You stay quiet when your gut says, "This isn't okay." Why? Because being alone in your belief is far scarier than being wrong in a crowd. And your brain knows that, so it gives you a gift. It adjusts what you think to match what they think. And the wildest part, it doesn't feel like you've compromised. It feels like you've seen the light, like you've grown, matured, learned. But what you've really learned is how to blend. We are social creatures. Our brains evolved on the savannah, where exile meant death, disagreement meant danger. Lone wolves didn't survive, so we developed a shortcut. If everyone else believes it, just go along. The logic of the tribe became the logic of the self, and today, that same instinct rules your phone, your feed, your friend group. Thousands of retweets? It must be true. A popular take? It must be smart. Everyone's saying it? Then who are you to question? But here's the scary truth. The more people believe a lie, the more dangerous it becomes, because no one wants to be the first to say, "Wait, that's not right." So here's a challenge for the next time your head is nodding. Pause. Ask, do I believe this, or do I just not want to disbelieve it? Because truth doesn't come from applause. It comes from courage. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop nodding and start thinking. Inherited thought. In 1994, a man named Daryl Davis walked into a bar that was hosting a white supremacist rally. He's black. He wasn't there to protest. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to listen. And over the next 30 years, he would go on to befriend more than 200 members of the Ku Klux Klan, not to convert them, not to attack them, but to ask one simple question. How can you hate me if you don't even know me? Many of those men eventually left the Klan, not because they lost a debate, but because they lost the illusion that everyone in their world agreed with them. Something cracked, and in that crack, new thoughts had room to grow. People don't often change their minds through facts. They change when their social world changes, when the air around them shifts, when someone walks in and makes their certainty feel a little less solid. We rarely notice it, but the most powerful force shaping our thoughts isn't logic. It's consensus. You start to think what your group thinks, not because you're trying to fit in, but because it feels true. When everyone around you laughs at a joke, it starts to seem funny. When they get angry at a news story, you start to feel angry too. You're not pretending. You're adapting. It feels like you're thinking, but really, you're sinking. There's a term in psychology for this: informational social influence. It means we often look to others to figure out what's true, especially when we're uncertain. And the more people seem sure, the more we copy them. Not because we're weak, because we're human. Your brain doesn't want to reinvent the world from scratch every morning, so it takes a shortcut. If this is what everyone else thinks, it's probably right, and that shortcut works. Until it doesn't. Imagine this. You're raised in a town where everyone believes that expressing emotions is a sign of weakness. You internalize it. You don't cry. You flinch at vulnerability. You nod when someone says, "Toughen up." Years later, you move to a different city. You meet people who talk about their feelings without shame. They seem strong, not fragile. They listen when others cry. And suddenly, a belief you never questioned starts to wobble. That's the moment you realize you didn't choose your belief, you inherited it. Like an accent, like a reflex, like a costume you forgot you were wearing. We all do this. We don't just echo ideas, we echo the way our group sees the world. Some groups teach you to argue, others teach you to nod. Some teach you that disagreement is rude, others teach you that silence is complicity. Your beliefs are built on scaffolding you didn't design. They were handed down like family heirlooms, stitched with the voices of those around you. And if you never examine that stitching, you'll wear someone else's mind and call it your own. So here's a thought experiment. If you were born in a different country, to a different family, in a different decade, would you still believe what you believe now? And if the answer is no, then who are you, really? The answer isn't to reject your group. It's to step outside it once in a while, just long enough to ask, is this me thinking or just me reflecting what everyone else thinks? Defending what you don't believe. Let me tell you a story. In 1954, a woman named Dorothy Martin claimed to receive messages from extraterrestrials. She said the world would end in a great flood on December 21st. But her followers, part of a small doomsday cult, believed they'd be rescued by a spaceship if they remained faithful, so they gathered. They waited. They prepared. December 21st came, and nothing happened. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You'd think they'd admit they were wrong, that they'd walk away, that they'd abandon the belief. Instead, they doubled down. They said their faith had saved the world, that the aliens had spared humanity because the group had shown such loyalty. They began spreading the message more. A psychologist named Leon Festinger was embedded in that group, and what he witnessed became the foundation of a concept called cognitive dissonance. When your actions don't line up with your beliefs, your brain doesn't like the tension, so instead of changing your actions, you twist your beliefs. But here's the twist. Sometimes, you don't even realize you never held the belief in the first place. Think about arguments you've had online. You read a post. Someone says something you disagree with, a little. Then someone replies to them, aggressively. You jump in to defend them. You make a strong case. You argue with intensity. 10 minutes later, you realize you don't even care that much about the original issue. It's not your belief. You were just in too deep. You defended it because it became yours the moment you argued for it. Or imagine this, you're with friends. Someone criticizes a movie you kind of liked. You start defending it. You say things like, "It was actually really smart if you think about it. People just didn't get it." But you didn't love the movie. You didn't even think it was that good. You just didn't like how it was dismissed. So now, you're the film's ambassador. Later, you catch yourself recommending it to others, not because you believe in it, but because you started acting like you did. Here's the uncomfortable part. Behavior solidifies belief. Once you've made a public stand, your mind wants to make sense of it, so it edits your internal story to match the performance. You join a team and start to believe in the mission. You vote for a candidate and start defending every policy. You buy a brand and suddenly feel it's the best in the market. It's not because you reasoned your way there. It's because you don't want to feel like you acted without reason. So you backfill the belief. This is why debates often don't change minds. They create identity investment. The more someone argues a position, the more that position becomes entangled with who they are. And then losing the argument feels like losing a part of themselves. So what do? They defend the belief harder, louder, longer, even if deep down they're not sure they ever believed it. Here's the thought experiment. What's a belief you've defended that you never stopped to question? If someone asked why you believe it, would your answer start with you or with something you heard, repeated, or absorbed? You might be surprised at how many of your strongest arguments are built on foundations you never inspected. And once you realize that, you start to see how belief isn't always about truth. Sometimes it's just about not feeling foolish for what you said yesterday. Silence, consent. Solomon chapter 45. When silence is agreement, and you believe it. You're in a group chat. You send a message, something slightly risky. Maybe a joke. Maybe an opinion. And then, nothing. No replies. No reactions. Just silence. Your mind starts spinning. Did I go too far? Did they all agree and just move on? Do they disagree but don't want to say it? But then, a strange thing happens. You start to decide what their silence meant. And once you've decided, you believe it. Silence isn't neutral. Your brain interprets it. And most of the time, it interprets it in your favor. They didn't argue, so I must be right. They didn't object, so they must agree. They didn't say anything, so it's settled. This is the illusion of consensus through silence. But here's the uncomfortable part. Silence doesn't mean agreement. It means nothing. It could mean confusion, discomfort, disinterest, distraction, or simply not knowing how to respond. Let me tell you about a study. In meetings, when people introduce bad ideas, those ideas often go unchallenged, not because everyone agrees, but because no one wants to be the first to object. And once the idea moves forward, everyone assumes it must have been good. Because no one spoke up, it creates a feedback loop of false agreement. Someone says something, others stay silent. The speaker assumes agreement. The silence deepens. The illusion becomes a belief. This plays out in politics, in families, in classrooms, even in friendships. You might avoid expressing doubt because no one else did, but you also assume everyone else believes more strongly than they really do because no one said otherwise. And so a fragile web of unspoken assumptions turns into an artificial consensus. Here's where it gets dangerous. If someone says something harmful and no one speaks up, the silence becomes permission. Not just in their mind, but in everyone's. I guess it's fine to say that. No one objected, so I will too. I didn't like it, but I guess I'm alone. You're not alone. You're just surrounded by other people waiting for someone else to go first. So what can you do? Recognize this. Silence is a mirror. You see what you project into it. If you want to know what someone really thinks, you have to ask. You have to open space for disagreement. You have to invite the challenge instead of assuming it would come on its own, because silence isn't truth. It's just the sound of people not being ready or brave enough to speak. Forced opinions. You're scrolling. A breaking news headline flashes across your feed. Everyone's reacting. Fast. Hot takes. Outrage. Support. Memes. More outrage. And suddenly you feel it too, the pressure to say something, to weigh in, to pick a side, to prove you've thought about it. But here's the question. What if you haven't? What if you don't know enough yet? What if you're confused? What if your real opinion is, I need to learn more, doesn't matter? Because the culture trains you to believe that not having an opinion is weakness. This is one of the strangest traps of modern life. You don't just feel pressure to have opinions, you feel pressure to have them immediately. We mistake speed for intelligence, certainty for confidence, and public reaction for informed judgment. But the result is something corrosive. People speak before they think. They pick positions based on vibes, not facts. They lock themselves into takes they'll later have to defend, not because they believe them, but because they already said them out loud. Let me tell you about a term psychologists use: epistemic humility. It means accepting the limits of what you know, being aware that your knowledge is partial, uncertain, evolving. Sounds nice, right? But it's punished in public. You don't know? Haven't you read the report? What's your take on this? People don't ask, "What do you know?" They ask, "What do you believe?" And if you don't have an answer fast enough, you feel like you failed some social test. But here's the paradox. The people most worth listening to, the ones who've actually done the thinking, are often the slowest to speak. They've learned to wait, to read, to watch the dust settle, to resist the reflex of instant opinion. Because they know the cost of premature certainty. So what can you do? Start practicing this sentence. I don't know enough to have an opinion yet. It's not weakness. It's not ignorance. It's wisdom. It's refusing to let your ego fill in the blanks just to stay socially afloat. It's recognizing that not reacting is often the most honest and rare response. Culture-written reasoning. You grow up in a world where blue means boy, pink means girl, success means more money, and freedom means choice. No one sits you down and tells you these things, but they sink in, quietly, invisibly, like background radiation. And before you even know how to question the world, it's already shaped the way you think. Here's the illusion we all live with. I believe this because I've reasoned it out. But what if the reasoning itself, the categories you think in, the values you measure by, the questions you bother to ask, were already installed before you began? You might think you're using logic, but logic can only operate on the raw material it's given, and culture supplies that material. Let me give you a vivid example. In Western societies, people often ask, "What do you want to do with your life?" In many Eastern societies, the question is more like, "Who do you want to be for your family or community?" That subtle shift from individual achievement to relational harmony shapes careers, identities, even moral choices. Same brains, same neurons, different mental software. And because your cultural defaults feel so natural, you rarely notice them unless you step outside them. There's a famous experiment where American and Japanese students were shown underwater scenes. The Americans mostly noticed the big fish. The Japanese students noticed the background, seaweed, bubbles, currents. Why? Because one culture primes you to focus on individuals. The other primes you to attend to context and relationships. Even perception is shaped by culture. So if something as basic as what you see can be shaped, what about what you think is reasonable? Here's where it gets even more dangerous. You can't fully opt out of culture. But when you don't know it's influencing you, you start mistaking pre-installed values for universal truths. You might argue that democracy is always best, that romantic love should come before duty, that self-expression is sacred, that progress is good, but those aren't universal. They're cultural exports. And when you think of them as the only logical positions, you lose the ability to see outside your programming. So what can you do? You don't need to abandon your culture, but you do need to become aware of its fingerprints on your thoughts, values, and arguments. Ask yourself, is this belief something I chose or something I inherited without knowing it? Because until you ask that, you're not really reasoning, you're just reciting. Memory before belief. Memory feels like a hard drive. You store a belief. You recall it later. Same in, same out. But that's not how memory works. And definitely not how belief works. Because sometimes you look back at a past version of yourself, and you swear you always believed what you believe now, but you didn't. That's just your memory, lying to keep your identity intact. This is called retrospective belief bias. It's the mind's habit of editing your memories so that your past self looks more like your present one. Why? Because you want to feel consistent. You want to feel stable. You want to believe that the you who made past decisions and the you sitting here today are part of a clean, coherent story. So when your beliefs change, which they do, constantly, your memory often rewrites the past so it doesn't feel like they changed at all. Let's make it real. Have you ever read an old message or diary entry and been shocked by how you thought back then? You might think, wow, I can't believe I used to think that. But give it a few months, and that new belief will feel like you've always had it. You won't even remember the shift. It's like belief creep. Not just a change of opinion, but a quiet retrofitting of memory to match your current views. This gets dangerous when it affects moral judgment. You see people who change their minds about politics, climate, identity, relationships, and claim, "I knew it all along." Not only is that false, it makes it harder to admit mistakes. Because if we always believed the right thing, we never had to face the reality that we were once wrong. So we miss the actual transformation, the moment of growth, discomfort, realization, and we replace it with a fake sense of moral continuity, which is comforting, but dishonest. Here's what's more honest and harder. I used to believe something else. I don't anymore, and I'm not ashamed of the version of me that got it wrong. That statement is rare because it threatens the illusion we work so hard to protect, that we are consistent, that we are stable, that our past selves were just early drafts of our current wisdom. But you're not a polished novel. You're a messy, evolving notebook. And that's not a weakness. That's a sign you're actually learning. Fictional past selves. What's the most powerful story you've ever heard? Chances are it's the one you're telling yourself about who you are, where you came from, what it all means. You might not say it out loud, but in the back of your mind, it's always running, a quiet narrator stitching your memories into a plot. The problem: that narrator isn't just reporting the facts, it's editing them, and sometimes rewriting the whole genre. Here's what we know. Memory isn't a file drawer, it's a creative process. When you recall a moment from your past, your brain doesn't pull it up like a photograph. It reconstructs it, piece by piece, filling in gaps, adding tone, applying meaning. And the meaning is shaped by your current beliefs. So if you see yourself now as a survivor, you'll cast your past in terms of hardship. If you see yourself now as a failure, you'll highlight the moments that prove it. You are, quite literally, curating the past to support the story you believe now. Let me give you two people with the same childhood. Both grew up poor, struggled in school, had distant parents. One tells the story like this: "I was neglected. I had to raise myself. I never stood a chance." The other says, "I learned to be independent early. I had to fight for everything, and I did." Same events, different plot, different identity, and that identity shapes the future. This is called narrative identity, the idea that who you are isn't just what you've experienced, but how you explain what you've experienced. It's your personal myth, and like any myth, it can be empowering or imprisoning. When people enter therapy, they're often not just confronting trauma, they're confronting the story they've used to explain it. I was always broken. No one ever cared. I always ruin everything. These aren't memories, they're conclusions. And conclusions can be challenged. So the question isn't, what happened to me? The deeper question is, what story am I telling about what happened, and who would I be if I told it differently? You can't change the facts, but you can change the frame. You can be a victim in one version, a fighter in another, a fool, a hero, a learner, a late bloomer, and none of it is fake, because stories aren't false. They're chosen. The real growth is realizing you're the narrator, not just the character. The absent self, who's watching your thoughts. You might say, well, I am. But pause. Who's the I in that sentence? The one that sees your thoughts, hears your inner voice, and knows what you're feeling. That sense of an internal observer, the real you, quietly sitting behind your experience. It feels so real, but what if it's just another thought? Here's a strange truth from neuroscience and psychology. The self, the inner narrator, the voice you think is you, is not a single unified thing. It's a process. Your brain is a swirl of competing impulses, emotions, memories, and predictions. And what you call me is just the temporary winner of that internal contest. It's like a press secretary giving a speech after the decisions were already made. You don't see your thoughts as they arise. You see a version of them, edited, interpreted, rationalized. And then You feel like you chose them. Try this. Sit in silence. Don't think anything. Just observe. Within seconds, a thought appears. You didn't summon it. You didn't plan it. But it came. And you noticed it. So, who noticed? It feels like you're the observer. But that observer is just another construction, a part of your brain reporting on itself. A self-model. A helpful illusion that gives you the sense of continuity and control. Without it, your thoughts would feel like random noise. But with it, you feel like a captain steering the ship, even if the wheel isn't connected. This realization is unnerving, because we're taught to trust our inner witness, to go inside for clarity, to listen to the voice within. But what if the voice inside is just another echo of conditioning, memory, culture, and bias? What if the observer isn't watching from the outside, but is trapped inside the system it's trying to observe, like a camera filming itself or a knife trying to cut itself? So does this mean you're not real? No. It means your sense of self is real, but flexible. It means the you who observes is not an all-knowing judge, but a shifting process built from stories, sensations, and patterns. And that's not a loss. It's freedom. Because if the self is constructed, it can be reconstructed. You're not trapped by who you were. You're not limited to your current lens. You can step back and see even the observer itself as part of the story. And that might be the first real observation you ever make. Wrong problem focus. Ever spent hours fixing something only to realize it wasn't broken? That's what happens when your brain locks onto a problem that feels solvable instead of the one that actually matters. You think you're being productive. You think you're analyzing, strategizing, improving, but all you're doing is solving the wrong problem. Let's say you're feeling anxious all the time. You tell yourself, I need a better morning routine, or I just need to organize my workspace. So you buy a new planner, you clean your room, you download an app, and for a few days you feel better, but the anxiety returns. Because the real issue wasn't clutter. It was that you hate your job, or your relationship is breaking, or you're ignoring something deeply important. But your brain didn't want to face that. So it substituted a proxy problem, one with clean edges, simple solutions, clear wins, something you could fix, instead of something you'd have to feel. This happens in relationships too. You fight about dishes, schedules, tone of voice. But beneath that, there's resentment, loneliness, fear. The problem you're arguing about isn't the one that's hurting you, but surface problems are easier to name. So you keep solving them, over and over, while the real issue gets buried deeper. This isn't just personal. It happens in organizations, politics, science. Sometimes the budget's broken because the vision is broken. Sometimes the project keeps stalling because no one trusts each other. But it's easier to change a tool than confront a cultural dysfunction. So the real problems stay hidden under layers of false solutions. Psychologists call this misdirected problem solving. It feels like progress. It satisfies the logical part of your brain, but it doesn't touch the source of your pain, because the real problem is usually more emotional, more vulnerable, and far less controllable. And your mind is wired to avoid uncertainty, even at the cost of truth. So how do you catch yourself? Ask, if I solve this, what else will still be wrong? Is this problem neat because it's real? Or because it's comfortable? What am I avoiding by fixing this instead of that? Because sometimes solving the wrong problem is just a distraction from asking the right question. And learning to tell the difference is the beginning of actual change. False memory of certainty. You've felt it before. Someone shares a new fact. A big event happens. A shocking truth is revealed. And your brain whispers, yeah, I kinda knew that already. Except you didn't. You didn't act like it. You didn't prepare for it. You didn't say it out loud. But now that it's obvious, your memory gets rewritten. This is called hindsight bias, and it tricks you into believing you saw it coming after it already happened. Let me give you a famous example. In 2001, after the September 11 attacks, people across the world claimed, "I had a feeling something like this was going to happen." But before that day, almost no one said so. Intelligence agencies missed it. The public missed it. The government missed it. The moment an event becomes real, our brains go back and adjust the story. It was always leading to this. The signs were there. I should have trusted my gut. It feels like memory. But it's actually narrative construction, a defense mechanism that gives you a sense of certainty in an uncertain world. And it doesn't stop with big events. It happens in relationships, careers, even test results. You fail an exam? I knew I was going to fail. You break up with someone? I saw it coming the whole time. But did you? Or is your brain editing your past to make your present feel more coherent? Because admitting you didn't see it coming, that you were surprised, caught off guard, wrong, is deeply uncomfortable. So your mind builds a smoother story, one where you've always known, one where your identity stays intact. This bias is dangerous. It kills learning. If you think you already knew something, you don't investigate why you missed it. You don't analyze your mistake. You don't update your models. You don't grow. You just pat yourself on the back for a wisdom you didn't actually have. It also makes you unfair to others. You judge them for not seeing what now seems obvious. But obviousness is an illusion that only appears after the fact. So, how do you protect yourself? Whenever you hear yourself say, "I knew it all along," pause. Ask, if I really knew, what did I do about it? Did I prepare? Did I speak up? Did I write it down? If not, it wasn't knowledge. It was a story. And if you can admit that, you gain something far more valuable than fake certainty. You gain the humility to say, "I was surprised. I didn't know. But now I do. And here's what I've learned." That's how real wisdom starts. Fooled, destroyed identity. Imagine this. You believed something, deeply, proudly, maybe for years. You argued for it. You built part of your identity on it. You defended it in conversations, maybe even taught it to others. And then, you learn it was wrong. Worse, you were misled, fooled, duped, used. What happens in that moment is more than embarrassment. It feels like part of you dies. Psychologists call this an ego threat. But that doesn't really capture the weight of it. Because when a belief is part of your identity, to admit it was false is to admit, "I'm not who I thought I was." And that's terrifying. You don't just lose the belief. You lose the version of you who held it. And now you're stuck in a strange psychological trap. If you cling to the false belief, you preserve your identity, but stay in the dark. If you admit the truth, you grow but lose a piece of yourself. This is why cult deprogramming is so hard. It's not about facts or logic. It's about grief. A grieving of the past, of your choices, of trust. Even outside of cults, we see this in politics, religion, even product loyalty. You buy into something emotionally, socially, financially, and then new information shatters it. That influencer lied. That idea you loved was based on junk science. That guru was manipulating you. The facts don't hurt as much as the implication. I was a fool. But here's the truth. Being fooled doesn't make you foolish. Staying fooled, because you're afraid to admit it, does. Everyone gets taken in sometimes. It's human. It's inevitable. But the people who grow are the ones who can look themselves in the mirror and say, "I believed something that wasn't true. I was wrong. And now I'm changing." Not because they want to feel wrong, but because they'd rather be wrong than stay false. Here's a trick. Don't frame it as betrayal. Frame it as clarity. I wasn't stupid. I was sincere. I wasn't naive. I was open. I wasn't blind. I was just looking in the wrong place. You're not discarding who you were. You're refining it, updating it, becoming more honest. And that's not death. That's growth. Protective narratives. You don't resist change with logic. You resist it with a story. A story that explains everything. A story that makes you feel like the hero. A story that makes staying the same feel not just safe but right. Even when you're stuck. Even when you're hurting. Even when, deep down, you know something isn't working. Let's say you hate your job. You feel drained every day. You daydream about quitting. But you don't. Because your story says, I need stability. This is just what adulthood is. I can't walk away after everything I've built. So you stay. Not because you love it, but because your narrative tells you it makes sense. That's how self-protection works. It doesn't argue with the facts. It wraps them in meaning, just enough meaning to neutralize them. This happens in relationships too. You convince yourself they're not perfect, but no one is. It's just a rough patch. I'm not easy to love either. The story becomes armor, not against pain, but against change. Because change is scary. It threatens who you think you are. If you leave, it might mean you wasted years. If you admit the truth, it might mean you've been lying to yourself. So you keep the story. You protect the version of you that doesn't have to do something terrifying. And here's the trap. The more time you spend inside that narrative, the more real it feels. It becomes your truth, even if it's not the truth. Because the brain doesn't just want accuracy, it wants consistency, coherence, a self that makes sense, even if it's built on fiction. But here's the hard question. What story are you using to avoid the truth? What if your problem isn't knowledge or motivation or fear? What if it's the narrative you've built? The one that tells you this is just how things are. That story feels safe, but it's keeping you exactly where you are. If you want to change, you don't just change your behavior, you change your story. You rewrite the script that makes staying feel noble and leaving feel like failure. And you realize the most dangerous lies are the ones you tell yourself to survive the life you no longer want. Meta-trap awareness. You've probably had this moment. You learn about a cognitive bias, confirmation bias, hindsight bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect, and you think, aha, I'll watch out for that now. You feel smarter, more self-aware, protected. But here's the trap. Knowing about the trap doesn't stop you from falling into it. In fact, it can make you fall deeper. This is called the bias blind spot, the tendency to see biases in others, but not in yourself. You read about motivated reasoning and immediately start diagnosing your political opponents. You learn about projection and think of your ex. You hear about sunk cost fallacy and point to your boss. But rarely do you stop and say, where am I doing this right now? What belief am I defending out of pride? What am I too scared to examine? That's the hard part, because now that you know better, you start mistaking knowledge for change. Here's a painful truth. You can become fluent in psychology, memorize every fallacy, quote Kahneman and Tversky, in your sleep, and still be driven by the same emotional logic you always were, just with fancier language. You've swapped ignorance for intellectual armor. You defend your identity with concepts like internalized bias or cognitive dissonance, but you're still avoiding the core fear that maybe you're not as objective as you thought. Self-awareness is a mirror, but it's not a ladder. It reflects the problem, but it doesn't lift you out of it. And that's where many of us get stuck. We think, because I can name the trap, I've escaped it. But you haven't. You've just illuminated it. Real escape, that's slower, more honest, less glamorous. It means catching yourself mid-justification, pausing when you're about to rationalize, owning the feeling before the defense kicks in. It means being wrong without trying to make it sound smart. So the next time you catch yourself thinking, I know all about that bias, ask a deeper question. Do I know what it feels like when I'm doing it myself? Because awareness is a start, but humility, that's the exit. Paralysis by doubt. There's a kind of wisdom that wears a disguise. It looks smart, it sounds sharp, it feels responsible. It's the voice that says, but how do we know for sure? What if that's just another illusion? What if the truth is we can't trust anything? This is hyper-skepticism, and it starts as a strength, but quickly becomes a trap. Let me paint a picture. A man sees through the lies of a political party, so he questions the media. Then he questions experts, then science, then facts, then reality itself. He's not uninformed. He's overinformed. Every source has an agenda. Every conclusion has a flaw. Every truth is someone's tool. So what does he believe? Nothing. And who does he trust? No one. He's not thinking anymore. He's stalling. This kind of doubt feels noble. After all, blind faith is dangerous. Naivete makes you vulnerable. Being skeptical feels like taking power back. But here's the problem. When everything is suspicious, nothing is meaningful. If every source is compromised, you stop listening. If every explanation is flawed, you stop learning. If every truth is just someone's narrative, you stop caring. And now you're not free from illusion. You're just floating in fog. This happens in philosophy too. You question the nature of reality. What if I'm just a brain in a vat? You question morality. But what is good, really? You question identity. What is the self? And soon you're caught in an intellectual whirlpool. Spinning so fast with doubt, you never move forward. You're aware of every trap, but unable to take a step. Here's the twist. Skepticism is a tool, not a destination. Its job is to test ideas, not destroy them all. It should be a filter, not a flamethrower. Real critical thinking asks, is this true? But it also asks, what do I do with this truth? How do I act with partial knowledge? How do I make peace with uncertainty? Otherwise, you're just using skepticism as a shield to never commit. Never trust, never risk being wrong, which feels safe but leads to nowhere. So if you've reached that place where every answer feels fake, every argument feels flawed, and every belief feels like a setup, remember, doubt is healthy until it becomes your excuse for never deciding. You don't need perfect certainty to move forward. You need enough clarity to choose and enough humility to adjust. Awareness isn't immunity. You realize you always seek validation. You notice you keep choosing emotionally unavailable partners. You know you procrastinate because of fear, not laziness. You catch yourself catastrophizing, and yet you keep doing it. This is the paradox of self-awareness. You spot the pattern. You understand the origin. You know the consequences, but the behavior doesn't stop. Why? Because insight is not transformation. It's just the spotlight. Let's say you've realized you people please. You know it's rooted in childhood. You know it's costing you authenticity. You know it's making you resentful. But next week when your friend asks you for a favor you don't want to do, what do you say? Of course I'd be happy to. You even hear yourself saying it, almost like you're watching it in slow motion. You leave the conversation thinking, why did I do that again? Because that's what patterns do. They don't live in your logic. They live in your nervous system. There's a name for this: emotional learning. Most of our core behaviors weren't adopted through reasoning. They were adopted through repetition, pain, survival, reward. So even when your mind knows better, your body is still acting out an old solution. You procrastinate not because you haven't learned discipline, but because stress has always meant freeze. You sabotage closeness not because you want to be alone, but because intimacy once meant danger. You avoid hard conversations not because you lack words, but because conflict once meant abandonment. That's why awareness can feel so frustrating. You're awake to your own dysfunction. You see it unfolding, and still, you can't seem to interrupt it. You might even start blaming yourself. I know better. Why can't I change? But knowledge is not control. Knowing the GPS coordinates of a fire doesn't mean you've put it out. So what does help? Repetition, environment, practice, slowness, safety. It's not glamorous, but it's how the nervous system rewires. Because if your habits are based on protection, then breaking them means creating something safer than the pattern itself. So don't beat yourself up for noticing without fixing. Awareness is not useless. It's the first light, but healing. Healing is what happens after the spotlight turns on, and you stop watching the pattern and start gently changing the choreography. The thinking limit. You've journaled about it, reflected on it, read 5 books about it, talked it through in therapy. You understand the childhood origin, the cognitive bias, the attachment style, the evolutionary explanation, and the brain chemistry behind it. And yet, you're still stuck. This is the moment no one warns you about, when thinking becomes the trap. At first, introspection feels like power. You can finally see yourself, your behaviors, motives, fears, patterns, but soon you start thinking about your thinking, then thinking about the thinking about your thinking, and trying to solve your emotions like they're math problems. You catch yourself in a moment of anxiety and wonder. What's the root of this thought? Is it fear of rejection? Fear of failure? Is this an abandonment wound? Is this a limbic system loop? Maybe I need to reframe this using CBT. Meanwhile, your body is just asking, can we breathe now? There's a reason this happens. Thinking is control. It gives the illusion that if you just figure it out hard enough, you won't have to feel it, won't have to experience it. It's safer to stay in your head, because the moment you stop thinking, you might actually feel grief, or shame, or helplessness. So instead, we try to think our way out of feeling, like solving a puzzle that keeps growing new corners. But some experiences don't want to be solved. They want to be moved through. This isn't anti-intellectual. This is about respecting the boundary of cognition. Imagine you're trying to learn to swim, but instead of jumping in, you keep watching tutorials, then analyzing your form, then reviewing your fears. At some point, you have to get in the water. Feel your limbs. Mess up. Adapt. Learn with your body. Healing is like that. You can't think your way to trust, or joy, or forgiveness, or presence. You have to practice them, sometimes awkwardly, clumsily, imperfectly, until they become familiar. The brain is a brilliant narrator, but not always a great leader. So if you find yourself thinking about why you can't stop thinking, try pausing. Feel the chair under you, the air in your chest, the tiny tension in your jaw, the movement of breath. No explanation attached, because sometimes the deepest healing doesn't sound like I figured it out. It sounds like I was quiet, and I stayed. Truth isn't enough. You finally understand. The facts are clear. The data checks out. The logic is airtight. You've laid it all out, for yourself or maybe someone else. And yet, nothing changes. You still cling to the belief. They still deny the evidence. The decision still hurts. The habit still repeats. So you ask yourself, if I know the truth, why isn't it working? Here's the hard reality. Truth is not the same as transformation, because we don't live by truth. We live by meaning, and meaning doesn't always follow facts. You can tell someone smoking causes cancer, and they'll nod and light up anyway. You can explain that a relationship is toxic, and they'll agree and go back again. You can show yourself every reason you should quit that job and still stay another year. Why? Because truth doesn't live in the head. It has to land in the gut, in the body, in the memory, in the emotional wiring, and that takes more than logic. It takes readiness, safety, timing, 1,000 soft things that can't be crammed into a spreadsheet. Imagine trying to convince a child there are no monsters under the bed. You shine a light, you show them, you explain, and still, they feel the monster, because the fear isn't logical, it's felt. And until the feeling shifts, the fear stays. Adults aren't so different. You might know you're worthy of love, but the belief doesn't live in your thoughts. It lives in that old, scarred place that once felt abandoned. You might know you're not responsible for someone else's emotions, but your nervous system still flinches like it is. This is why arguing with truth often fails. Because people don't change when they're told what's right. They change when what's true finally becomes what's real, when the insight sinks deeper than the intellect. So what helps? Sometimes it's hearing the truth again from a softer voice. Sometimes it's watching someone live it. Sometimes it's failing one more time until your body finally lets go. Not because you read the answer, but because you felt it. So the next time you wonder why the truth didn't fix it, don't panic. Don't give up. Just remember, truth is the seed, but transformation needs soil and time and warmth and space to grow. Caught in the loop. It's a quiet moment. You're about to send that angry message, or reopen the social media app, or reach out to someone who's already shown you who they are, or replay that same mental loop for the 100th time. And for a second, you hesitate. Not because the urge disappears, but because you notice it. That's it. That's the breakthrough. We talk about healing as if it's an exit door. Like there's some final version of yourself that never gets triggered again, never makes the same mistake, never feels weak or lost or small. But that version doesn't exist. Real healing isn't about escape. It's about recognition. You don't erase the pattern. You catch it. Not always before it starts, but sometimes before it goes too far. That moment of pause, that breath of awareness before the reflex kicks in, is the entire revolution. Think of it like riding a bicycle downhill with no brakes. At first, you don't even know you're on a slope. You think you're choosing to speed up, that you're in control, until you crash. Again, then one day you realize, oh, this wasn't momentum. This was a slope. That realization doesn't flatten the hill, but now you can brace, you can steer, you can slow down. Eventually, you can stop. And maybe next time you recognize the hill before you start down it. That's catching yourself. Let's go deeper. Imagine an addict in recovery. The cravings don't vanish overnight. The neural circuits don't magically rewire, but the addict starts noticing. This is the time of day it hits. This is what triggers me. This is the lie I tell myself right before I slip. Catching yourself is what builds the muscle of freedom, and this applies to everything. Snapping at people when you're scared. Performing for approval, shrinking when you feel too visible. Over-explaining to avoid abandonment. Saying yes when you mean no. Distracting yourself from discomfort. You can't always stop the impulse from rising, but you can stop yourself from blindly believing it. Catching yourself doesn't feel heroic. It often feels subtle, boring even. It's not a movie climax. It's quiet, mundane, private. It's closing your mouth when you're about to justify something you don't believe in. It's turning off your screen when the doom scroll beckons. It's replying with silence instead of proving your point. It's the 1,000 tiny choices no one sees, but they change everything because the space between impulse and action, that's where your freedom lives. And the more you catch yourself, the faster it happens. At first you notice after the fact, then during, then right before. Eventually, with practice, you preempt it. But you don't escape. You evolve. If you're waiting for the day when nothing pulls you into old patterns, you'll wait forever. But if you start practicing the skill of interrupting the pattern, you'll start feeling something even better than escape, self-trust. Because now, you don't need a perfect life or perfect circumstances to stay anchored. You need awareness, compassion, and the courage to pause. Even if the pattern screams, even if your brain says, this won't work, you'll always be this way. Because the moment you hear that voice and don't obey it, you've already won. Doubt as practice. Imagine this. You're in a dark room. You've been here for so long, you've memorized where the furniture is. You don't bump into anything. You don't trip. You've figured out how to move without getting hurt. Then someone comes in and flips on the light. Suddenly, you realize the room wasn't arranged the way you thought. The table is closer. The wall is farther. Some things you thought were safe were sharp, and some dangers weren't even there. Now here's the strange part. Even with the light on, you still feel tempted to walk the way you used to, because it feels safer. That's what it's like to doubt the beliefs you've lived by your whole life. Let's say you believe, if I'm not useful, people will leave me. It doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like reality. You don't say it out loud, but it shapes everything. You overwork. You over-explain. You avoid saying no. You stay in relationships that exhaust you because leaving feels selfish. And when someone tells you you don't have to earn love, you nod. You agree. You might even cry. But when it comes time to act, you still obey the old belief. Not because you're stupid, not because you didn't understand, but because that belief kept you safe, and your body hasn't caught up yet. This is why people stay in patterns long after they see the truth. The problem isn't just what you believe. It's how deep the belief is buried. And when something is buried deep, you can't rip it out. You have to gently loosen it. There's a kind of doubt that feels like war. You interrogate your thoughts. You demand evidence. You beat your beliefs into submission. But here's the twist. The beliefs that formed from fear don't respond to force. They respond to safety. So instead of asking, how do I destroy this belief? Try, what if this belief is outdated? What would I do if I didn't believe this, just for today? Where did this story come from, and do I still need it? These aren't attacks. They're invitations. And when your mind feels invited, not threatened, it starts to open. Here's a real story. A woman spent her whole life believing she was too much, too loud, too emotional, too needy. Why? Because growing up, every time she cried, her father went silent. Every time she got excited, her mother shushed her, so she learned to shrink. In therapy, she didn't try to destroy the belief. She listened to it. She asked, when did I first feel too much? Whose voice is that in my head? What if I was never too much? They were just overwhelmed. And slowly that old belief stopped feeling like her. It became just a voice, not the truth. That's what doubt can do when it's gentle. Doubting gently isn't passive. It's precise. It's patient. It doesn't scream. It curiously leans in, and over time, your thoughts soften, your reflexes shift. You stop reacting from old wounds and start choosing from real awareness. So next time you find a belief that feels unshakable, don't pull harder. Sit with it. Talk to it. Question it, like a friend, not to win, but to understand. Because the strongest beliefs don't need to be broken. They just need to be seen until they gently let go of you. Rationality and letting go. You followed the rules. You've analyzed your thoughts. You've learned about fallacies, cognitive distortions, social traps, and self-deceptions. You've questioned your questions, doubted your beliefs, and doubted your doubts, and yet something still feels off. Because underneath all of it, the introspection, the logic, the constant mental gymnastics, there's a quiet feeling you can't shake. You're still stuck in your head. Let me tell you a story. A philosopher once stood at the edge of a cliff, staring down into the sea. He'd spent his life trying to think his way to truth. Every idea tested, every belief doubted. But the more he reasoned, the more he unraveled. His mind, once sharp, had become a hall of mirrors. Every argument reflected another. Every conclusion collapsed into another contradiction. He didn't want to die. He just wanted out. Out of the noise, out of the endless thinking, out of the prison of his own overdeveloped intellect. And in that moment, he realized something terrifying. His mind had become so logical. It had made life unlivable. You don't have to be a philosopher to feel this. If you're the kind of person who overthinks, who picks apart your motives, questions every feeling, tracks every bias, then you know this mental trap. The better you get at seeing your own illusions, the harder it is to feel certain about anything at all. You start to distrust your intuition. You hesitate before making simple choices. You think about thinking, until you're paralyzed. And worst of all, you start to resent yourself for not being more rational. Here's the brutal irony. The more you try to be purely logical, the more you disconnect from the parts of you that make life worth living. Emotion, instinct, wonder, creativity, risk, play. But let's be clear, this isn't about following your heart in some vague romantic way. It's about reintegrating the mind with the rest of you, not using logic to suppress your humanity, but to serve it. Consider this. A soldier in a war zone learns to distrust loud noises. They signal danger. Years later, safe at home, a car backfires and he drops to the floor. Logically, he knows he's safe. But logic doesn't help. His body still reacts. Now imagine trying to logic your way out of that reflex. It won't work, not because you're stupid, but because that reaction is pre-verbal. It was formed in a place deeper than words. Much of your thinking is like that. The beliefs you hold, the fears you rationalize, the self-concepts you defend, many of them didn't start with reason. They started with experience, with pain, with unmet needs, with survival. Trying to fix them only with logic is like trying to fix a wound by reading about bandages. And yet, we keep trying because logic feels safe. It gives us the illusion of control. It makes us feel like we're doing something, thinking, analyzing, improving, but at some point, that safety becomes a cage. You don't move, you don't risk, you don't feel. You just think. Letting go of logic doesn't mean abandoning reason. It means releasing the illusion that reason is always superior, that it can solve every problem, explain every feeling, erase every fear. It means remembering that logic is a tool, not a god. It was designed to serve life, not replace it. Here's what that looks like. You stop arguing with your emotions and start listening to them. You stop needing to win every debate and start asking better questions. You stop trying to fix your pain with ideas and start feeling it. You stop demanding certainty and start exploring possibility. You don't stop thinking. You think differently. Less like a courtroom, more like a conversation. You allow silence. You allow contradiction. You allow not knowing. And slowly, your mind begins to soften. Not because it's weaker, but because it's wiser. You'll still fall into traps, still defend yourself, still overthink, still rationalize, still chase false certainty. But now you'll catch yourself. Not to punish, not to fix, but just to notice. And in that noticing, a space opens, a space where life can move again, where thoughts aren't walls, but windows, where doubt isn't paralysis, but presence, where logic no longer imprisons you because you've remembered how to feel. So if you've reached the end of this journey, wondering what it was all for, it was never about destroying your mind. It was about freeing it. Not by sharpening your thoughts, but by loosening your grip on them. Letting logic serve life, not the other way around. And maybe, just maybe, that is the most rational move you'll ever make.